Ethan Johnson had everything: money, power, and a tech empire that made him one of the most influential men in the United States. But in the silence of his luxury penthouse, surrounded by breathtaking views and cold walls, there was one thing money could never buy: the truth about the dark past he was only beginning to uncover. When a mysterious woman, a street artist with nothing to lose, enters his life, Ethan is pulled into a labyrinth of secrets, betrayals, and painful revelations that will make him question everything he thought was real. With the unexpected return of someone he never imagined seeing again, Ethan's life is about to implode. And as danger lurks closer, he'll realize the true threat isn't from what's coming, but from what's always been beside him. The truth is about to surface, but at what cost? The rain fell lightly as Ethan Johnson wandered through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, his mind heavy with thoughts he'd been trying to escape for months. The memory of his mother, Laura, lingered painfully in every corner of his life. 5 years ago, she had passed away, leaving behind not only a hole in his heart, but also a legacy he felt undeserving of. Ethan wasn't just a man of wealth, he was one of the tech industry's brightest minds. At 28 years old, he had created innovations that people around the world used every day, products that simplified lives, and in return, filled his bank account. But none of it mattered. The sprawling penthouse, the expensive cars, and the respect he commanded in boardrooms all felt meaningless now. Today was especially hard. His phone had buzzed earlier with a reminder, 5 years since her passing. Ethan had always dreaded this day, but this year, the weight of his solitude was crushing him. He didn't have anyone to call, no one to share the ache that gnawed at him. For someone so successful, it was ironic how alone he felt. As he walked through the old neighborhoods of Venice Beach, where he used to roam as a kid, he spotted something unusual. A woman, older, probably in her 70s, dressed in layers of worn clothes, sat on a bench, scribbling furiously in a sketchbook. Her face was wrinkled, her hands aged and shaky, but her focus was intense. Ethan paused for a moment, curious about her. There was something familiar in the way she moved, something that tugged at him, but he couldn't place it. "Nice day for a walk," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. The woman looked up, her eyes sharp and full of a life Ethan hadn't expected. "Depends on how you see it," she replied, her voice gravelly but kind. She looked back down at her sketchbook, continuing to draw. Ethan could see it now, a beautiful landscape forming beneath her skilled hands. For someone living on the street, she had the grace of an artist, a professional one. He hadn't planned to talk to her. Ethan wasn't the type to stop for random strangers. But today, something about her kept him standing there. "Are you an artist?" he asked, breaking the silence. She nodded, not looking up. "Used to be. Once. Before. Life." Her answer was vague, but Ethan didn't push. He knew the feeling all too well, life pulling you away from who you thought you were. Minutes passed before he spoke again. "You live around here?" She paused, as if considering whether to tell him the truth. "I live wherever I can. Been on these streets for years, but it's not so bad. I have my art." Her eyes flickered with a distant sadness, and Ethan felt a pang of empathy. How had she ended up like this? Without thinking, he blurted, "I have a place, an apartment, in the garage. It's small, but if you ever needed somewhere to stay." The offer surprised him as much as it did her. Why was he offering his space to a stranger? He didn't even know her name, but something deep within him felt drawn to help her. She looked up sharply this time, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why would you do that? What's your angle, kid?" Ethan didn't flinch at the accusation. He'd been called worse in business negotiations. "No angle. I've got space, and you look like you could use it." The woman's eyes softened for a moment, but then she quickly shook her head. "I've learned the hard way that nothing comes free." "Thanks, but no thanks." Ethan didn't insist. "It's there if you need it, no strings attached." He turned to walk away, but before he could take 2 steps, she called after him, "Why me?" Ethan stopped. He didn't know how to explain it, the pull he felt. Maybe it was her artistry, something his mother had loved, or maybe it was just his loneliness, searching for any kind of connection. He shrugged. "I don't know." "You remind me of someone." The woman watched him carefully. She still didn't trust him. Years of life on the streets had taught her that much. But something in Ethan's face, the quiet sorrow that lingered there, made her consider his offer more seriously than she had intended. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Ethan offered her a brief smile. "The name's Ethan, by the way. If you change your mind, I'll be around." As he walked away, he felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. He didn't know what had just happened, but for the first time in months, something in his life felt different, unsettled, but in a good way. Maybe this meeting wasn't an accident. Maybe, just maybe, this woman had come into his life for a reason. Back on the bench, the woman watched him disappear into the street, her thoughts swirling. She didn't trust easily, and yet there was something about him, something that reminded her of a life she once knew, a past she had buried long ago. "I'll think about it," she whispered to herself, though deep down, she already knew the answer. Ethan Johnson sat in his sleek penthouse overlooking downtown Los Angeles, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman he had met earlier, Mabel. There was something about her, something familiar and yet distant, that had sparked a strange sense of connection. He barely knew her, but her eyes held a depth he couldn't shake, as if they carried stories from a lifetime long gone. Ethan wasn't one to make impulsive decisions, yet offering Mabel a place to stay had felt natural, almost necessary. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared out at the city. The wealth, the success, it all felt so hollow without someone to share it with. It had been like this since his mother's death. Laura Johnson had been his rock, his guiding force, and without her, Ethan had struggled to find meaning in his achievements. Every day felt like he was climbing a mountain, only to reach the top and realize there was nothing there. His mother had been gone for 5 years, but the pain of her absence still gnawed at him like it had happened yesterday. His phone buzzed on the countertop, snapping him out of his thoughts. A notification, a reminder, the anniversary of her death. He swiped it away, not wanting to be reminded of the ache that lived inside him. Restless, Ethan grabbed his jacket and left his penthouse. His feet carried him back toward the Venice Beach area, where he had met Mabel. Maybe it was stupid to hope she'd still be there, but something about her had drawn him in. He needed to know more, who she was, where she came from. He felt as though her story was tied to his, in a way he couldn't yet understand. As he walked through the dimly lit streets, the sound of the city fading into the background, his mind wandered back to his childhood, the days when his mother would take him to art galleries, her love for painting a constant in their lives. Laura had never been an artist herself, but she had appreciated art deeply, often spending hours discussing the emotions behind each stroke, the passion that poured into every canvas. Ethan had never fully understood it, until now. Meeting Mabel, seeing her raw talent, had sparked something inside him. After some time, Ethan reached the same spot he had encountered Mabel earlier that day. To his surprise, she was still there, sitting on the bench, her sketchbook open on her lap. The light from a nearby street lamp cast a soft glow around her, illuminating the rough lines of her face. She looked tired but focused, completely absorbed in her drawing. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach. He didn't want to come off as intrusive, but his curiosity got the best of him. Slowly, he walked over and sat down on the edge of the bench, giving her space. Mabel didn't look up from her sketchbook. "You again," she muttered, her voice flat but not unkind. "Figured you'd be off in your fancy apartment by now." Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, I couldn't stop thinking about you." She finally looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Me? Why's that?" Ethan shrugged. searching for the right words. "I don't know. There's just something about you, something familiar. And I don't know, I just feel like I need to help," Mabel scoffed. "Help? People like you don't help people like me. You don't know what it's like to live out here, to have nothing." Ethan flinched at her words, but didn't back down. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to live on the streets, but I do know what it feels like to be alone." Mabel looked at him then, really looked at him. For the first time, she saw beyond the wealth, beyond the success. She saw the sadness in his eyes, the same sadness that lived inside her. "You, alone?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You've got the world at your feet, kid." Ethan shook his head. "I've got everything money can buy, but it doesn't mean anything without someone to share it with." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Mabel softened, just a little, and she closed her sketchbook, setting it aside. "Why'd you offer me that place? What's in it for you?" Ethan leaned back, staring up at the night sky. "Honestly, I don't know. I guess I just saw someone who reminded me of my mom. She loved art, used to take me to galleries all the time. When I saw you drawing, it brought me back to those days." Mabel stayed quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the sketchbook. "I had a life once," she said finally, her voice low and filled with regret. "I was an artist, lived in New York for a long time, but things fell apart. Bad decisions, bad people." Ethan turned to face her, intrigued by the vulnerability in her voice. "What happened?" Mabel shook her head, as if trying to shake off the memories. "That's a story for another time, kid. Let's just say, life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it." Ethan nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. "I get that." For the first time, Mabel looked at him without suspicion. She saw a young man who, despite all his wealth and success, was just as lost as she was, maybe even more. There was a part of her that wanted to push him away, to keep the walls she had built around herself intact. But there was another part, a part that longed for connection, for a sense of belonging. "All right," she said softly. "I'll take you up on your offer, but don't expect me to be some kind of charity case. I'll pull my weight." Ethan smiled, relief flooding through him. "Deal." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The city hummed around them, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. As they stood to leave, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something important, something that would change both of their lives forever. The following morning, Ethan woke up to the faint sound of birds chirping outside his window. Sunlight streamed into his penthouse, casting a warm glow over the minimalist decor, but the beauty of the morning felt distant to him. The decision he'd made the previous night lingered in his mind, offering Mabel a place to stay. Part of him questioned why he had done it, but a deeper part, the part that longed for human connection, knew the answer. Ethan's routine was usually strict: wake up, work out, then dive into his latest tech projects. But today was different. He couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to Mabel and the strange, inexplicable bond he felt with her. He found himself wondering if she would actually take him up on his offer, and if she did, what that would mean for him. For years, he had lived alone, his space, his sanctuary from the world outside. Allowing someone into his life, especially a complete stranger, was a risk, one he hadn't taken since his mother's death. By midday, he still hadn't heard from Mabel, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. His phone remained silent, leaving him in a state of uncertainty. Ethan had never been the kind of person to leave things to chance. In his world, everything was planned, calculated, but this felt entirely out of his control. Unable to shake the restlessness, he decided to check in on the garage apartment he had mentioned to Mabel. It wasn't a part of his property that he visited often. It was more of a storage space, but he had converted a section of it into a small apartment in case he ever needed a live-in assistant or guest quarters. The place hadn't been used in years, and Ethan figured it would need some preparation if Mabel were to stay there. Walking into the garage, Ethan felt a wave of nostalgia. His mother's old car was still parked in the far corner, covered with a tarp. It was a relic of his childhood, a reminder of simpler times when Laura would drive him to the beach on weekends or to art museums across the city. He hadn't touched the car since her passing, and even now, looking at it felt bittersweet. He brushed off the memories and focused on the task at hand. The apartment was small, but comfortable. Just enough space for someone to live simply. It had a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a small living area with a couch and bed. As he surveyed the room, he realized how bare it felt. The walls were empty, the shelves untouched. The place lacked any sense of warmth, and Ethan wondered how someone like Mabel, an artist with so much depth, would feel living in such a sterile environment. Maybe I should ask her if she needs anything, he muttered to himself, making a mental note to do so if she accepted his offer. Before long, the sound of footsteps caught his attention. He turned around to see Mabel standing at the entrance of the garage, her figure small against the large metal door. She looked different in the daylight, older, more fragile than he had remembered from the night before. Her clothes were still worn and layered, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, as if the hardships she had faced couldn't diminish her spirit. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up," Ethan said, surprised but relieved to see her. Mabel gave a half smile, her eyes scanning the room behind him. "I thought about it, figured I'd at least come and see what you were offering." Ethan gestured toward the small apartment. "It's not much, but it's clean. You'd have your own space. No one bothers me here, so you'd have privacy." Mabel stepped inside, her hands grazing the countertop in the kitchenette as she looked around. "It's more than I've had in a long time," she admitted quietly. "You're sure about this?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I meant what I said, no strings attached. If you want to stay, the place is yours." For a moment, Mabel didn't say anything. She just stood there, taking it all in, as if trying to decide whether to trust this sudden change in her life. Trust wasn't something that came easily to her anymore, not after everything she had been through. But looking at Ethan, she saw a sincerity that she hadn't seen in a long time. "All right," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll stay, but I'm not taking charity. I'll help out around here. Do whatever you need." Ethan smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Deal." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their agreement settling over them. For Ethan, it felt like the first real step towards something new, something he couldn't quite define yet. And for Mabel, it was a chance, a fragile, uncertain chance to rebuild some part of her life that she had thought was long gone. "You hungry?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "There's a diner down the street. We could grab something to eat." Mabel hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" As they walked down the street together, Ethan found himself opening up in a way he hadn't expected. He told Mabel about his mother, about the anniversary of her death, and how it had been haunting him. Mabel listened quietly, her eyes thoughtful. "I know what it's like to lose someone," she said after a while. "People say time heals, but that's a lie. You just learn to live with it." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The pain never really went away. It just became part of you, a shadow you carried with you every day. When they reached the diner, they slid into a booth by the window. The place was old, a relic of the 1950s with red vinyl seats and a jukebox in the corner. Mabel ordered a black coffee and a plate of pancakes, while Ethan went for his usual eggs and toast. As they waited for their food, the conversation turned to lighter topics, and Ethan found himself laughing at some of Mabel's stories from her days in New York. "I wasn't always this old, you know," Mabel said with a wry smile. "I had my fun back in the day, used to run with some wild crowds in the art scene." Ethan chuckled. "I bet you have some crazy stories." Mabel leaned back in her seat, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "You have no idea." They spent the next hour swapping stories, sharing parts of their lives that had long been hidden away. For Ethan, it was refreshing, a break from the cold, detached world of business he had become so accustomed to. And for Mabel, it was the first time in years that she had felt like she was part of something again, like she wasn't just another invisible face in the crowd. As they left the diner and headed back to the apartment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger. He had spent so long isolated, disconnected from the world around him, but now, with Mabel, there was a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. It wasn't just about helping her, it was about finding a way back to himself. Over the next few days, Mabel settled into the small apartment in Ethan's garage. It was quiet and private, just as Ethan had promised. The apartment itself wasn't luxurious, but after years of sleeping on park benches and under bridges, it felt like a palace to Mabel. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had a roof over her head that didn't threaten to collapse at any moment. There was a bed to sleep in, a stove to cook on, and even hot water for a shower. Small luxuries that she hadn't allowed herself to dream of. Ethan, true to his word, didn't push her. He didn't treat her like a charity case or smother her with offers of help. Instead, he gave her space, letting her adjust at her own pace. That was something she could respect. Though Mabel was initially suspicious of Ethan's generosity, she began to let her guard down. There was something genuine about him. He wasn't like the other wealthy people she had encountered in her life, people who either ignored her or looked down on her. Ethan wasn't arrogant or dismissive. He was lonely. The more time she spent around him, the more she realized they were both broken in their own ways. And in that brokenness, they found a strange sense of camaraderie. One evening, after spending the day organizing her belongings in the garage apartment, Mabel made her way to the main house to talk to Ethan. She hadn't seen much of him since moving in, except for the occasional brief conversation. She found him in his living room, staring out at the city skyline through the large windows that overlooked downtown Los Angeles. "You know, you could do with some company every now and then," she said, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan turned around, a faint smile on his lips. "I have company." Mabel raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest. "I mean real company, not just me crashing in your garage." Ethan chuckled softly. "Your real company." They both sat down, the comfortable silence of mutual understanding filling the space between them. Ethan had been thinking about this, about how quickly Mabel had become a part of his life. It was strange how easily he had opened up to her, considering how closed off he had been to everyone else. "You know, I wasn't always like this," Mabel said, interrupting the quiet. She hadn't planned on talking about her past, but something about the atmosphere felt right. "I used to be someone back in New York. I had it all, or at least I thought I did." Ethan leaned forward, interested. He had been waiting for Mabel to open up, but he hadn't wanted to push. Now, she was offering a glimpse into her life, and he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. "What happened?" he asked gently. Mabel sighed, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the coffee table. "Life happened. You think you're invincible, that you've got everything figured out, and then one day, it all falls apart. I was an artist, a damn good one too, but I got mixed up with the wrong person, Frank." She spat the name out as if it tasted bitter. "He was charming at first, like they all are, promised me the world, told me I'd be famous. And I believed him." Ethan stayed quiet, sensing that this was a story Mabel needed to tell without interruption. "I stopped painting for myself," she continued, her voice laced with regret. "I started painting what he wanted, what would sell. It was all about money for him. He took control of everything, my work, my life, my family." She paused, her voice catching on the last word. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Your family." Mabel swallowed hard, the weight of the memories almost too much to bear. "I had a daughter, Sophie. She was my whole world. But Frank, he drove a wedge between us. He was controlling, manipulative, and dangerous. He used her to keep me in line. And then one day, she was gone. He took her from me. Ethan. I never saw her again." Ethan felt a pang of empathy for Mabel, her story echoing the sense of loss he knew all too well. "I'm sorry," he said softly, knowing that his words couldn't possibly ease her pain, but needing to say something. Mabel shook her head. "Don't be. It's my fault. I let him take control. I let him ruin my life, and I let him take Sophie. After that, I lost everything. My career, my home, my family. I ended up on the streets, just trying to survive." The room grew still, the weight of Mabel's story hanging in the air. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He could see the guilt and pain etched on her face, and it reminded him of his own demons, the guilt he carried over his mother's death, the pain of losing the one person who had always believed in him. "You didn't deserve that," Ethan said finally. "None of it." Mabel gave him a sad smile. "Life doesn't care what you deserve." Ethan looked away, his mind racing. He had offered Mabel a place to stay, but now it felt like he needed to do more. She had lost everything, and while he couldn't bring her daughter back or erase the years of pain, maybe, just maybe, he could help her find something worth living for again. "I have an idea," Ethan said, after a long pause. Mabel looked at him curiously. "What kind of idea?" Ethan stood up, pacing the room as he spoke. "What if you started painting again? I could help you set up a studio, get you whatever materials you need. You said you were an artist, and I think it's time you reclaimed that part of yourself." Mabel blinked, taken aback by his suggestion. She hadn't painted in years, not since Frank had torn her world apart. The idea of picking up a brush again felt foreign, and yet, deep down, there was a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know, Ethan," she said hesitantly. "It's been so long. I don't even know if I still have it in me." "You do," Ethan said firmly. "I've seen your sketches, Mabel. You're talented, and you owe it to yourself to try." Mabel studied him for a moment, seeing the conviction in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could be that person again, the artist she once was. But the fear of failing, of reopening old wounds, held her back. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, not pushing her any further. He knew it would take time, but for the first time since offering her a place to stay, he felt like he was truly helping her. Not with charity, but by giving her the chance to reclaim something she had lost. As Mabel left the main house and walked back to the garage apartment, her mind raced with thoughts of the past, the future, and the uncertain path ahead. She hadn't expected this when she had agreed to stay with Ethan. She had thought it would be temporary, a place to rest her head, but now it seemed like it could be something more. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she had believed. In the days that followed, Mabel found herself thinking more and more about Ethan's suggestion. The idea of returning to painting had been haunting her ever since he mentioned it, but she couldn't shake the fear that had taken root deep inside her. She hadn't picked up a brush in years. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? What if the passion she once had was gone for good? Every time she thought about trying, the memories of Frank would flood back, and with them, the pain of losing Sophie. The very thought of reopening that part of her life felt like inviting all that hurt back in. But the more she hesitated, the more restless she became. Something had changed inside her since moving into Ethan's garage apartment. For years, she had accepted her fate, living on the streets and expecting nothing from life. But now, having a place to call her own, however small, made her start to question whether she had given up too soon. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. "You owe it to yourself to try." Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time. Meanwhile, Ethan was wrestling with his own demons. He had thrown himself into work, attending back-to-back meetings and trying to distract himself with the demands of his tech company. But no matter how busy he made himself, the emptiness inside him gnawed at his soul. His success felt hollow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was searching for something more, something meaningful. At night, when the meetings were over and the emails were answered, he would sit alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city below. He thought about his mother often. Laura had been his guiding star, the one person who understood him better than anyone else. Since her death, he had been drifting, lost in the vast ocean of his life, with no anchor to hold him steady. And now, Mabel was here. She was a stranger, yet he felt connected to her in ways he didn't fully understand. He saw in her the same loneliness, the same brokenness that he felt in himself. Maybe helping her was a way to help himself. Maybe, by encouraging her to rediscover her art, he could find a piece of the purpose he had lost. One evening, Ethan decided to check in on Mabel. He hadn't seen her much since their last conversation, and he wondered if she had given any thought to his offer. He walked over to the garage apartment and knocked lightly on the door. After a few moments, Mabel opened it, her expression a mix of surprise and weariness. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan smiled. "I just wanted to see how you're settling in." Mabel motioned to the small apartment. "It's a lot better than where I was before, that's for sure." "I'm grateful, Ethan. I really am." Ethan sat down on the edge of the couch, his gaze flicking to a blank canvas leaning against the wall. "Have you thought any more about painting?" Mabel sighed and sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've thought about it a lot. But every time I think about picking up a brush, I remember everything I lost. It's hard to go back to something that reminds you of so much pain." Ethan nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I get that, but maybe it's not about going back. Maybe it's about moving forward, taking what you've been through and turning it into something new." Mabel looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She could see that he wasn't just talking about her, he was talking about himself, too. "What are you running from, Ethan?" she asked quietly. The question took him by surprise. He had spent so much time focusing on Mabel's pain that he hadn't stopped to think about his own. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "My mother's death. It left this hole inside me that I haven't been able to fill. No matter what I do, no matter how successful I become, it never feels like enough. I've spent years trying to outrun the grief, but it always catches up to me." Mabel's gaze softened. "You're not alone in that. We're all running from something, aren't we?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I guess so." For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air between them. But in that silence, there was also a sense of understanding, a recognition that they were both trying to find their way back from the dark places life had taken them. Eventually, Mabel stood up and walked over to the blank canvas. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and setting it on the easel. Ethan watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if she was going to follow through, but there was something different in her demeanor, something determined. Mabel reached for a paintbrush, her hand trembling slightly as she held it. She dipped it into a small jar of paint and hesitated for only a moment before making the first stroke across the canvas. The motion was slow, almost tentative, but once the brush touched the surface, something shifted inside her. The fear that had been holding her back began to melt away, replaced by the familiar rhythm of creation. Ethan watched in awe as Mabel transformed before his eyes. The years of pain, loss, and regret didn't disappear, but they no longer had the same power over her. With each stroke of the brush, she reclaimed a part of herself that had been buried for so long. Mabel painted for hours, lost in the flow of her work. Ethan stayed by her side, silently encouraging her as she created something new from the fragments of her past. By the time she finally stepped back from the canvas, she was exhausted, but there was a light in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen before. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked softly. Mabel looked at the painting, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Like I've taken the first step toward finding myself again." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride for her. "You did it." Mabel nodded, still staring at the painting. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it didn't need to be. It was a start, and for the first time in years, that was enough. As the days passed, Mabel continued to paint. Slowly but surely, she began to rediscover the passion she had thought was lost forever. Each new piece she created was a testament to her resilience, her ability to rise from the ashes of her old life and build something new. Ethan, in turn, found a sense of purpose in supporting her. Watching Mabel reclaim her art gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to fill the void in his own life. He started spending more time with her, discussing her ideas, encouraging her to experiment with different styles, and even offering to help her enter local art competitions. One afternoon, after weeks of watching her grow more confident with each painting, Ethan approached Mabel with a proposal. "There's an art competition coming up," he said, handing her a flyer he had picked up at a gallery. "I think you should enter." Mabel stared at the flyer, her expression a mix of surprise and hesitation. "A competition? Ethan, I'm not ready for something like that." Ethan shook his head. "You're more ready than you think. You've been hiding your talent for too long. It's time to show the world what you can do." Mabel bit her lip, torn between the fear of failure and the desire to prove to herself that she still had something to offer. "What if I'm not good enough?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, his voice gentle but firm. "You are good enough. You've been through hell, Mabel, and you've come out the other side. You've got nothing to prove to anyone but yourself." Mabel looked down at the flyer again, her heart racing. Could she really do this? Could she put herself out there after all these years? The thought terrified her, but as she looked at Ethan, at the unwavering belief in his eyes, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe it was time to stop running from her past. Maybe it was time to face it head on and show the world and herself that she still had something to offer. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice soft but filled with determination. Ethan smiled, knowing that the decision was already made. Mabel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the small garage apartment. The flyer for the art competition rested on the nightstand beside her, its bright colors glowing faintly in the dim light. She had told Ethan she would think about it, but deep down, she knew the decision was already made. She was going to enter the competition. The thought terrified her, but it also excited her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Could this be her chance to reclaim the life she had lost? But the fear was still there, gnawing at her. What if she failed? What if her work wasn't good enough? What if entering this competition only reminded her of everything she had lost? The memories of Frank and Sophie were always lurking in the back of her mind, waiting to pull her back into the darkness. Every time she thought about moving forward, those memories held her back. The next morning, she found herself standing in front of the blank canvas again, paintbrush in hand. This was her life now, wasn't it? A series of small steps, pushing through the fear, one brushstroke at a time. She dipped the brush into the paint and let her hand move across the canvas, slowly bringing the image in her mind to life. It wasn't easy. Her mind was cluttered with doubt, but she forced herself to keep going. This was how she was going to face her past, by turning it into art. As the days passed, Mabel's routine became one of quiet focus. She spent her mornings painting, losing herself in the process. It was as if each stroke of the brush was a way to take control of her story again, to reshape the narrative that had been stolen from her. By afternoon, she would take long walks through the neighborhood, breathing in the life around her. For years, she had been invisible to the world, but now, with Ethan's quiet encouragement, she was beginning to feel like she had a place again. Meanwhile, Ethan's life seemed to be following a different rhythm. He had watched Mabel grow more confident in her work, and seeing her progress had brought him a sense of pride he hadn't expected. But there was still an emptiness in his own life that he couldn't shake. His mother's death had left a hole in him, and no amount of success in business could fill it. Watching Mabel reconnect with her art gave him hope, but it also highlighted the void he had been trying to ignore. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Ethan found himself walking into Mabel's apartment. He had developed a habit of checking in on her after work, eager to see her progress and hear about the latest piece she was working on. Mabel had come to expect his visits, though she still found it strange that someone like Ethan, a man who had everything, would be so invested in her art. "Hey," Ethan said as he stepped inside. His eyes landed on the painting Mabel had been working on and his face lit up. "Wow, that's incredible." Mabel smiled faintly, stepping back to let him get a better look. "It's getting there." Still a work in progress. The painting was a striking landscape, filled with rich, bold colors that seemed to pulse with emotion. It was clear that Mabel was pouring everything she had into her work. Her pain, her memories, her hope. Ethan could see it in every brushstroke. "You've really got something here," Ethan said, his voice filled with admiration. "This could win the competition, Mabel." Mabel snorted, shaking her head. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just trying to get it finished." Ethan looked at her, his expression serious. "I mean it, you've got talent, and this competition could be the start of something new for you." Mabel sighed, her eyes drifting back to the canvas. "Maybe, but I'm not doing this to win. I'm doing it because I need to. After everything that's happened, I need to prove to myself that I can still do this, that I'm still me." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had been chasing success for years, but the emptiness he felt wasn't something that could be filled with money or achievements. Mabel was right. Sometimes, the real battle was proving to yourself that you still had something left to give. "I get that," Ethan said softly. "More than you know." Mabel looked at him curiously, sensing the heaviness in his tone. "What are you trying to prove, Ethan? You've got everything. Money? Success?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I have all that, but none of it matters. Not without someone to share it with." He paused, glancing out the window at the city below. "My mom, she was the one person who believed in me, the one person who really knew me, and when she died, it was like I lost a part of myself. I've been trying to fill that void ever since, but nothing works." Mabel studied him for a moment, her heart softening. "You're not alone, Ethan. We all lose people. We all carry scars, but that doesn't mean we stop living." Ethan gave her a small smile. "I guess you're right." The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Despite the vast differences in their lives, they had found common ground in their shared pain. It was a strange kind of friendship, but it worked for them. Finally, Mabel broke the silence. "You should come to the competition." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Me? I thought you didn't want anyone there." Mabel shrugged. "I didn't, but I'd like it if you were there. You've been with me through this whole process, and I guess it'd be nice to have someone in my corner." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I wouldn't miss it." As the competition day approached, Mabel threw herself into her work with renewed focus. She finished the painting she had started and even began working on a second piece, feeling more confident with each stroke of the brush. The fear that had held her back for so long was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. She was beginning to believe in herself again. The night before the competition, Mabel sat in her apartment, staring at the two finished paintings. They were both beautiful, but they represented so much more than just her talent. They were a testament to her resilience, to her ability to rise from the ashes of her old life and rebuild herself. She hadn't been sure she could do it, but now, looking at her work, she knew she had taken the first step. Ethan knocked on her door, a quiet smile on his face when she let him in. "You ready for tomorrow?" he asked. Mabel nodded, though there was a nervous edge to her smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." Ethan glanced at the paintings, his admiration clear. "You're going to do great, Mabel. No matter what happens, you should be proud of yourself." Mabel looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Ethan. I don't think I could have done this without you." Ethan shook his head. "You did this, Mabel. I just gave you a little nudge." As they stood there, both of them feeling the weight of the moment, Mabel realized that Ethan had become more than just the man who offered her a place to stay. He was a friend, someone who believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. And for the first time in years, Mabel felt like she had a future worth looking forward to. The day of the art competition arrived sooner than Mabel expected. She stood in front of the mirror in the small garage apartment, adjusting her jacket nervously. It had been years since she had been in a public space like this, let alone in the spotlight. The last time she had entered a competition, she had been a different person, full of ambition and hope, before Frank had come into her life and shattered everything. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was a different time, a different Mabel. She wasn't here for recognition or validation. She was here for herself, to reclaim the artist inside her. Still, the nerves fluttered in her chest, and she wondered if she was truly ready for this. A knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, looking as polished and composed as ever. His eyes softened when they met hers. "You look great," Ethan said, giving her a reassuring smile. Mabel smirked, rolling her eyes. "I look like I haven't done this in a decade." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Trust me, you're gonna do fine. You're ready for this." Mabel didn't respond immediately, but there was a part of her that believed him. Ethan's unwavering support had become a steady presence in her life, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. "Thanks, Ethan," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "For everything." Ethan shrugged, though there was a seriousness in his expression. "You don't have to thank me, Mabel. You're doing this on your own. I'm just here to cheer you on." Together, they loaded Mabel's 2 paintings into Ethan's car and made the drive to the competition venue in downtown Los Angeles. The event was being held in an art gallery, its glass walls showcasing a wide array of artwork from local artists. As they pulled into the parking lot, Mabel's anxiety spiked. The sight of people milling about, carrying their own works of art inside, made her heart race. Ethan noticed her discomfort and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said quietly. Mabel nodded, though her nerves were getting the best of her. "I hope so." Inside, the gallery was buzzing with energy. Artists and art enthusiasts filled the room, each one examining the displayed pieces with careful scrutiny. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she and Ethan carried her paintings inside and handed them to the event organizers. Watching her work disappear into the hands of strangers felt strangely intimate, like she was baring her soul for everyone to see. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, sensing her tension. "I will be," Mabel replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Once her paintings were displayed, there was nothing left to do but wait. Ethan stayed by her side, offering quiet words of encouragement. But Mabel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. This wasn't just about the competition, it was about proving to herself that she still had something to offer, that the years she had spent living on the streets hadn't stolen her identity as an artist. Hours passed, and slowly, people began to take notice of Mabel's work. She watched from a distance as visitors stopped in front of her paintings, discussing them in low voices. Some seemed impressed, while others moved on quickly. It was a strange feeling, being judged again after so many years. The vulnerability of it all made her stomach twist. But as the day wore on, something surprising happened. More and more people gathered around her pieces, lingering longer than they had at the beginning. Whispers of praise reached Mabel's ears, and she found herself stunned by the positive reactions. It had been so long since she had heard anything good about her art that she almost didn't know how to process it. "I think you've got a hit," Ethan said, grinning as he watched the crowd form around her paintings. Mabel blinked, still in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why are they all so interested?" Ethan turned to her, his expression warm but serious. "Because you're talented, Mabel. You've been hiding from that for too long." Mabel swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent years telling herself that her talent didn't matter, that she wasn't good enough, but standing here now, seeing the way people responded to her work, she began to wonder if maybe she had been wrong. As the day drew to a close, the judges of the competition began to make their rounds, assessing each piece of art with critical eyes. Mabel watched them approach her paintings, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been both dreading and hoping for. One of the judges, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, studied Mabel's work closely. She nodded slightly, exchanging quiet words with the other judges before moving on. The entire process lasted only a few minutes, but to Mabel, it felt like hours. "I can't believe I actually went through with this," Mabel muttered under her breath as the judges moved on. Ethan smiled at her, his pride evident. "You did it, Mabel. No matter what happens next, you've already won." Mabel wasn't sure she agreed, but Ethan's confidence in her was reassuring. As the judges finished their rounds, the crowd gathered for the announcement of the winners. The gallery buzzed with excitement as the head judge took the stage, microphone in hand. "And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for," the judge began, her voice echoing through the gallery. "It has been an honor to review the incredible talent displayed here today. Our decision was not an easy one, but we are pleased to announce this year's winners." Mabel's heart pounded as the judge began listing off the winners of various categories, her hands clenched into fists, the anxiety almost unbearable. She hadn't come here expecting to win, but now, standing in the middle of the crowd, she couldn't help but hope. And for the Best Emerging Artist Award, the judges have selected Mabel Gardner for her stunning landscape paintings. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Mabel's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief. Had she heard that right? Ethan nudged her gently. "That's you, Mabel." The crowd erupted into applause as Mabel stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She had won. She had actually won. "Go on," Ethan whispered, his smile as wide as ever. "This is your moment." With shaky legs, Mabel made her way to the stage, the applause echoing in her ears. She accepted the award from the judge, her hands trembling as she took the small plaque. Standing in front of the crowd, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her, pride, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This wasn't just a victory in the competition. This was a victory over the fear and doubt that had haunted her for years. It was a reminder that she was still an artist, still capable of creating something beautiful despite everything she had been through. As she stood there, the crowd still clapping, Mabel glanced at Ethan. He stood at the back of the room, watching her with pride in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Mabel felt like she belonged somewhere. The days following Mabel's win at the art competition felt surreal. She hadn't just placed, she had won a major award for Best Emerging Artist, something she hadn't dared dream about. The small plaque now sat on the modest kitchen table in her garage apartment, catching the sunlight that filtered through the window. It was a symbol, not of the victory itself, but of something far more important, Mabel's rebirth as an artist, as someone who could still create beauty out of the brokenness of her past. The recognition had come with more than just applause and a plaque. Galleries were beginning to express interest in her work, something she had never imagined would happen again. Ethan, as usual, had been her constant supporter, and watching her win had filled him with pride. But something had shifted in their dynamic as well. Now that Mabel was finding her footing, Ethan found himself struggling with his own sense of purpose. One afternoon, as they sat together in the backyard of Ethan's penthouse, Mabel could sense something was weighing on him. He was usually so composed, but today there was a tension in his shoulders, a quiet discomfort that told her something was wrong. "You've been awfully quiet lately," Mabel said, breaking the silence as she sipped her coffee. "Everything okay?" Ethan glanced at her, offering a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, just thinking." Mabel raised an eyebrow. "That's never a good sign." Ethan chuckled softly, though there was no humor behind it. "It's nothing, really. I'm just trying to figure out what's next for me." "What do you mean?" Mabel asked, her curiosity piqued. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting out over the city. "You found your passion again, Mabel. Your painting. winning awards, and people are finally recognizing how talented you are. But I'm still stuck. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with my life." Mabel frowned, surprised by his admission. Ethan had always seemed like the kind of person who had everything figured out. He was wealthy, successful, and respected in his industry. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how deeply lonely and lost he was beneath the surface. "You've got your company," Mabel said gently. "You're doing big things with it." Ethan shook his head. "The company is fine, but it's not fulfilling. It used to be, back when I thought success would make me happy. But now," he trailed off, his voice heavy with frustration, "now I just feel empty, like no matter what I achieve, it's never enough." Mabel nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had spent years feeling that same sense of emptiness, searching for meaning in a world that seemed determined to strip it away from her. "You're chasing something that doesn't exist, Ethan," she said quietly. "Happiness doesn't come from success or money. It comes from connection, from doing something that matters to you." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought the company mattered to me. I've built something huge, something people rely on. But it still feels hollow." Mabel studied him for a moment, her heart softening. "You need to figure out what matters to you outside of work. Maybe that's something creative, or maybe it's helping people. But whatever it is, it's not going to come from more success or more money. You've got to look deeper." Ethan's brow furrowed as he considered her words. He had been avoiding that very question for years, burying himself in work to avoid the deeper issues. But now, watching Mabel rebuild her life and rediscover her passion, he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to find something that gave his life meaning, something that made him feel like he was living for more than just the next big deal. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Mabel smiled gently. "You start by being honest with yourself. What makes you feel alive, Ethan? What gives you that spark?" Ethan stared out at the horizon, lost in thought. He hadn't felt truly alive in a long time, not since his mother had passed. She had been his anchor, the one person who understood him completely. Without her, he had drifted, caught up in the whirlwind of work and success, trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled with material things. "I used to feel that way with my mom," Ethan said after a long pause. "She was the one who kept me grounded. After she died, I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense. But now, I don't know. I just feel like I'm going through the motions." Mabel nodded, her heart aching for him. She knew the pain of losing someone you loved, the way it could leave you feeling adrift, without purpose. "Your mum would want you to find your own path," she said softly. "She wouldn't want you to live your life like this, feeling lost and empty." Ethan looked down, his jaw tight. "I know, but it's easier said than done." Mabel reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone, Ethan. You've been there for me through all of this, and I'm going to be here for you. We'll figure this out together." Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have all the answers yet, but knowing that Mabel was in his corner made the uncertainty a little easier to bear. As the weeks passed, Mabel continued to receive offers from galleries and collectors interested in her work. Her art had become a reflection of her journey, a blend of the pain, resilience, and hope that had defined her life. Each new piece she created was infused with the emotions she had spent years burying. And now that she was painting again, she couldn't imagine stopping. One afternoon, while working on a new landscape, Mabel received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Adams, the housekeeper who had worked for Ethan's family for years. Mabel had grown close to Mrs. Adams during her time at Ethan's house, often sharing cups of tea and stories of the past. But today, Mrs. Adams sounded different, worried. "Mabel, I need to talk to you about something," Mrs. Adams said, her voice tense. "It's about Ethan." Mabel's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" "I think he's in trouble," Mrs. Adams said quietly. "He's been acting strange lately, more withdrawn than usual. He's barely been to the office, and he's been avoiding calls from the board. I'm worried he's not handling things well." Mabel frowned, her concern growing. She knew Ethan had been struggling, but she hadn't realized how deeply it was affecting him. "I'll talk to him," she said, her voice firm. "Thanks for letting me know, Mrs. Adams." After hanging up, Mabel felt a knot of worry settle in her stomach. Ethan had always been good at hiding his pain, but it was clear that something was wrong. She decided to confront him directly. That evening, Mabel found Ethan in his office, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of him. His desk was cluttered with paperwork, and there were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Ethan, we need to talk," Mabel said, stepping into the room. Ethan glanced up, his expression weary. "What's going on?" "I'm worried about you," Mabel said bluntly, taking a seat across from him. "Mrs. Adams told me you've been avoiding the office, and you're not taking calls from the board. What's going on, Ethan?" Ethan sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Mabel. I can't do it anymore. I feel like I'm drowning." Mabel's heart ached for him. She had seen this coming, but she hadn't realized how deep his struggle had become. "You need help, Ethan. You can't keep going like this." Ethan shook his head. "I don't know how to ask for help. I've always been the one people rely on. I don't know how to be the one who needs saving." Mabel leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. Let's figure this out together." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit that he wasn't okay, that he needed help. "Okay," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't want to feel like this anymore." And with that, the walls Ethan had built around himself began to crumble, revealing the pain he had been hiding for so long. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, but with Mabel by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to face it alone. Over the next few days, Ethan began the slow, painful process of confronting the emptiness that had been eating away at him for so long. For years, he had buried himself in work, telling himself that success would fill the void left by his mother's death, but that had never been the answer. Now, with Mabel's support, he started to open up, though it was far from easy. Mabel had become his rock, much like he had been for her when she was rebuilding her life through art. She knew that this wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. Ethan had been carrying the weight of his grief and loneliness for years, and it would take time for him to unravel the emotional knots that had formed inside him. One evening, after a long day of dealing with business matters, Ethan sat with Mabel in the kitchen of her garage apartment. The place had become a refuge for him, a space where he didn't have to put on the mask of the successful tech mogul. Here, with Mabel, he could just be himself. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life," Ethan said, stirring his tea absently. "This empire I've built, it's not me, it's what I thought I had to be." Mabel nodded, understanding. "We all do that, Ethan. We create these identities, these versions of ourselves that we think will make the world love us or respect us, but in the end, it's just a mask." Ethan sighed. "I've been hiding behind that mask for so long, I don't even know who I am without it." Mabel took a sip of her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "You're more than your success. You're more than your company. But you need to figure out what does make you feel alive. You need to find something that's just for you, not for anyone else." Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowed. "But what if I don't know what that is? What if I never find it?" Mabel smiled softly. "You will. But you have to be willing to look for it. It's not going to fall into your lap. You have to be open to the idea that there's more out there for you than just business deals and profit margins." Ethan nodded, though the uncertainty still weighed heavily on him. "I don't even know where to start." "You've already started," Mabel said gently. "By admitting you're not happy, you've already taken the first step. The rest will come." As they sat in the quiet of the evening, Ethan found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since Mabel had come into his life. She had been a stranger, someone he had helped on a whim, but now she had become one of the most important people in his world. Her resilience, her courage to face her past, had inspired him to do the same. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about finding meaning, about building a life that wasn't defined by what he owned or what he had accomplished. Mabel had found that meaning in her art. And though Ethan wasn't sure what his path would look like, he knew he couldn't keep living the way he had been. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to take small steps toward reclaiming his life. He started spending less time at the office, delegating more responsibilities to his team, and focusing on things that brought him peace. He took long walks through the city, often ending up at the beach where he used to go with his mother. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore helped him feel grounded in a way he hadn't in years. He also began reconnecting with old friends he had lost touch with. For so long, he had kept people at arm's length, afraid of letting anyone get too close. But now, he realized that isolation wasn't the answer. He needed people in his life, real connections that went beyond business deals and networking events. One afternoon, Ethan invited Mabel to come with him to the beach. It was a cloudy day, the kind of day that usually kept tourists away, leaving the coastline quiet and peaceful. As they walked along the shore, Ethan felt a sense of calm settle over him. "This was my mom's favorite place," Ethan said, his voice soft. "We used to come here all the time when I was a kid. She said the ocean made her feel small in the best way, like her problems didn't matter in the grand scheme of things." Mabel smiled as she listened. "Your mom sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Ethan said, a hint of sadness in his voice. "Losing her, it broke something in me. I don't think I've ever really recovered." Mabel stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes filled with understanding. "You never truly get over losing someone like that, but you learn to carry it. It becomes a part of you, and in time it doesn't hurt as much. You'll always miss her, but that doesn't mean you can't find joy in other parts of your life." Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. "I just don't know how to let go of the guilt. I feel like I should have done more, been there for her more." "You did what you could, Ethan, and I'm sure she knew how much you loved her." Mabel's voice was gentle, but there was a firmness to it, like she wasn't going to let him drown in his self-blame. They stood in silence for a moment, the waves lapping at their feet. Mabel could see how deeply Ethan was struggling, and it reminded her of the days when she had felt just as lost. She had been in his shoes, filled with regret and self-doubt, wondering if she would ever find a way out of the darkness. But she had, and now it was Ethan's turn. "Have you ever thought about doing something creative?" Mabel asked, breaking the silence. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Creative? Like what?" "I don't know," Mabel shrugged. "Something that makes you feel alive. Painting, music, writing, anything that lets you express yourself." Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm not exactly the artistic type, Mabel." "You don't have to be," Mabel said, her eyes twinkling. "It's not about being good at it. It's about finding something that gives you joy, something that's just for you." Ethan considered her words, the idea lingering in his mind. He had never thought of himself as creative, but maybe that was because he had never allowed himself the chance to try. His entire life had been about logic and business, about making calculated decisions and maximizing profit. But maybe there was room for something more. "I'll think about it," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet. Mabel smiled, sensing a shift in him. "Good. Because you've spent too long living for other people's expectations. It's time you started living for yourself." As the weeks passed, Ethan took Mabel's advice to heart. He began experimenting with different hobbies, trying to find something that sparked his interest. He took up photography, spending hours wandering around the city, capturing the world through his lens. There was something therapeutic about it, the way it allowed him to see things from a new perspective. It wasn't about perfection or success, it was about finding beauty in the everyday. Mabel watched him with quiet pride, knowing that he was beginning to find his way. It wasn't a quick process, but it was a start, and that was all that mattered. One evening, After a particularly productive day of painting, Mabel sat down with Ethan in the backyard, the soft glow of the setting sun casting a warm light over them. "You're different," Mabel said, studying him closely. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Mabel smiled. "You're lighter, happier." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky. "Yeah, I guess I am. It's still hard, though. I miss her every day." "You always will," Mabel said softly. "But that doesn't mean you can't find joy in your life now." Ethan nodded, the truth of her words settling over him. He had spent so long running from his grief, but now he was learning to live with it. It wasn't easy, but with Mabel's help, he was beginning to heal. As they sat in the quiet of the evening, Ethan realized that he had finally found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, and there were still days when the darkness crept in, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. And with Mabel by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to walk it alone. The weeks passed, and both Ethan and Mabel found themselves settling into a new rhythm, one where healing and growth became a part of their daily lives. Mabel's art had gained increasing attention, with gallery owners reaching out to her, offering to showcase her work. For Mabel, it was a strange sensation. After years of struggling with self-doubt and living in the shadows, she was slowly stepping back into the light. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't chasing fame or validation. She was painting for herself, for her own sense of fulfillment. Ethan, too, was undergoing his own transformation. The pressure he had carried for years, the weight of running a tech empire and trying to live up to impossible expectations, had started to ease. It was as if Mabel's influence had unlocked something inside him, reminding him that there was more to life than board meetings and quarterly profits. But despite the progress they had made, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had spent his entire life in pursuit of success, yet now that he had all the outward trappings of achievement, he found himself wondering what it had all been for. He had lost his mother, and with her, the connection to anything that felt real. And although he had Mabel now, a true friend who understood his pain, the emptiness in his heart still lingered. One afternoon, as Mabel was finishing up a new painting in her garage studio, Ethan walked in. His usual calm demeanor was tinged with restlessness, as if something had been eating away at him all day. "You okay?" Mabel asked, noticing his tension. Ethan sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't know. I've just been thinking a lot lately about everything. My mom, my life, what I'm doing with it. It's like the more I try to figure things out, the more lost I feel." Mabel set down her brush and wiped her hands on a rag, giving him her full attention. "That's part of the process, Ethan. You're not going to have all the answers right away." Ethan nodded, but the frustration in his eyes didn't fade. "I know, but it feels like I'm still searching for something I can't even name." Mabel studied him for a moment before speaking. "Maybe it's not something you need to find. Maybe it's something that will find you when you least expect it." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds a little too philosophical for me." Mabel chuckled softly. "Life's got a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. You can't plan for everything, Ethan. Sometimes you just have to let go and see where things take you." Ethan sighed again, his mind still swirling with uncertainty. "It's hard for me to do that. I've always been in control. I've built my life on planning, on knowing what's coming next." "Maybe that's the problem," Mabel said gently. "You're trying to control something that's out of your hands." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but her words stuck with him. He had always been a planner, someone who thrived on structure and predictability, but now, the very thing that had brought him success was holding him back. He needed to let go, to trust that life would unfold in ways he couldn't predict. Later that evening, after Mabel had returned to her apartment, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. The view had always brought him a sense of calm, but tonight it only reminded him of how small and insignificant he felt. He had spent so many years building this empire, yet here he was, alone, still searching for meaning. His thoughts drifted back to his mother, Laura, and the many conversations they'd had over the years. She had always been the one person who could see through his facade, who knew the real Ethan beneath the surface. Losing her had left a void in his life that no amount of success could fill. As he sat there, the memories of her came flooding back, bitter-sweet and painful. Suddenly, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Mrs. Adams, his mother's former housekeeper, and someone who had been a second mother to him after Laura's death. She rarely called unless something important was on her mind. "Hello?" Ethan answered, his voice a little more strained than usual. "Ethan, I've been meaning to talk to you," Mrs. Adams said, her tone serious but warm. "There's something I think you should know." Ethan frowned, sitting up straighter. "What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end, and Ethan could hear Mrs. Adams's hesitation. "I didn't want to say anything earlier because I didn't think it was my place. But I've been hearing things, rumors, about your mother." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of rumors?" Mrs. Adams took a deep breath. "I've heard whispers that your mother, Laura, didn't just die of illness. There's talk that she was trying to protect you from something. I don't know all the details, but I think there was more going on than you realize." Ethan's mind raced as he processed her words. "What do you mean, protect me? From what?" "I don't know, Ethan," Mrs. Adams said, her voice laced with concern. "But I've heard enough to believe that your mother was keeping something from you. Something important." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I didn't want to burden you, especially after she passed," Mrs. Adams explained. "But now, I'm starting to think you deserve to know the truth." Ethan's mind swirled with confusion and disbelief. His mother had always been open with him, or so he thought, but now, hearing Mrs. Adams talk about secrets and protection, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much bigger at play. "Do you know where I can find out more?" Ethan asked, his voice firm. Mrs. Adams paused again, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I don't know the full story, but I've heard that a man named Frank might know something. He's connected to your mother's past. I can't say more than that, but it's a place to start." Ethan's blood ran cold at the name. Frank. It was the same man Mabel had mentioned, her manipulative ex, the one who had driven her to the streets and taken her daughter, Sophie, from her. The connection between Mabel's past and his own was too strange to be a coincidence. "Frank," Ethan repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "He's the one who hurt Mabel." Mrs. Adams seemed surprised. "You've heard of him?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his heart pounding. "Mabel, she knew him. He ruined her life. And now you're telling me he might be connected to my mother." "I don't know for sure, Ethan," Mrs. Adams replied, her voice filled with regret. "But you need to be careful. Frank's dangerous. If he's involved, this could be more complicated than we realize." Ethan's mind raced. He had to find out the truth about Frank, about his mother, and how their lives were intertwined. But he couldn't do it alone. After hanging up with Mrs. Adams, Ethan called Mabel, his voice urgent. "I need to talk to you. It's about Frank." Mabel's breath hitched on the other end of the line. "What about him?" Ethan paused, his heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. "He's connected to my mother. I don't know how yet, but I think there's more to this than we realized." There was a long silence before Mabel spoke again, her voice shaky but determined. "We need to find him, Ethan. We need to figure out what's going on." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know, but it's going to be dangerous, Mabel. Frank's not the kind of guy you can just confront. We have to be smart about this." "I don't care," Mabel said firmly. "He took everything from me. If he's involved in your mother's death, then we need to know the truth." Ethan's heart pounded as the weight of the situation settled over him. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about confronting the darkness that had haunted both of their lives for years. Together, they would face Frank, and whatever secrets he held, they were ready to uncover them. no matter the cost. The revelation about Frank left both Ethan and Mabel shaken. The possibility that he had been involved in Ethan's mother's life, or even her death, was almost too much to process. Yet there was no time for hesitation. Both of them knew they needed to act quickly if they were going to uncover the truth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning and research. Ethan used every resource at his disposal to dig up information on Frank. It wasn't easy. Frank had covered his tracks well, but through old business connections and discreet inquiries, Ethan began to piece together a trail. What he found left him more disturbed than he had expected. Frank wasn't just some manipulative ex-partner who had ruined Mabel's life. He was involved in a network of shady dealings that stretched across the city, linked to fraud, extortion, and more. And worst of all, it appeared that his name had surfaced around the time of Laura's death. One evening, Ethan sat with Mabel in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling through the windows as they pored over the information he had gathered. The tension in the air was palpable, both of them knowing they were inching closer to a dangerous truth. "Frank had connections to my mom," Ethan said, pointing to a document on the table. "Apparently, they crossed paths through some charity events years ago. But what's more troubling is this." He handed Mabel a file he had received from an old contact in the tech industry. "There's talk that Frank was trying to use her influence to get to me, something about my company." Mabel frowned, her fingers tightening around the edges of the file. "So he was after your company? That doesn't make sense. Why go through your mother?" Ethan shook his head, the frustration evident in his expression. "I don't know, but it looks like he was involved with some people who wanted a stake in the tech world. Maybe he thought my mom could help him get close to me, or maybe there's more to it than that. Either way, it seems like he was using her." Mabel's heart sank. The idea that Frank had manipulated another person, someone as kind and important as Laura, was sickening. "I never realized how deep his connections went," she murmured, her voice filled with regret. "I thought he was just a con artist, a manipulator. But this is bigger." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "I can't believe I didn't see it. I was so focused on my work, on building my company, that I didn't even notice what was happening to her." Mabel reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You couldn't have known, Ethan. Frank is dangerous. He hides in the shadows, manipulating people from behind the scenes. It's not your fault." Ethan nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing every aspect of his life and business. But this had slipped through his fingers, and it had cost him his mother. As the night wore on, the weight of the situation settled over them. They needed answers, but they also needed to be careful. Frank was dangerous, and they couldn't afford to make any rash moves. After hours of discussion, they decided on a plan. They would try to find Frank and confront him directly. It was a risk, but they knew it was the only way to get the truth. Ethan used his contacts to track Frank down, finding out that he had resurfaced in New York, operating under a new alias. It wasn't surprising. Frank was the type to reinvent himself after every scandal, slipping away before anyone could catch him. But this time, Ethan and Mabel weren't going to let him disappear so easily. With a clear target in sight, Ethan booked a flight for both of them to New York. The tension between them was palpable as they boarded the plane. Neither of them spoke much during the flight, each lost in their own thoughts. For Ethan, this trip represented a chance to finally get closure on his mother's death. For Mabel, it was an opportunity to confront the man who had taken everything from her. As the plane touched down in New York, Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The city was familiar to him. He had spent time here in the early days of his career, but now it felt different, more ominous. This wasn't a business trip. This was a personal reckoning. They checked into a hotel and spent the night planning their next steps. Ethan's contact had given them the address of a gallery where Frank had been seen attending an event recently. It was a high-end place, catering to wealthy collectors and powerful figures in the art world, the kind of place Frank would thrive in. The next morning, Ethan and Mabel made their way to the gallery. The air was crisp with the bite of fall, and the streets were buzzing with the usual New York energy. As they approached the gallery, Mabel felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She hadn't seen Frank in years, but the memories of him were still vivid in her mind. The way he had manipulated her, controlled her, and ultimately destroyed her life, it all came rushing back in an instant. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, sensing her unease. Mabel took a deep breath, nodding. "I have to be. He's taken too much from me already. I'm not letting him control my life anymore." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, though his own nerves were frayed. They both knew this confrontation could go in any number of directions, and none of them were particularly safe. They entered the gallery, the polished floors and pristine walls, a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath the surface. The event was in full swing, with art collectors and patrons mingling over glasses of champagne, admiring the works on display. Ethan and Mabel scanned the room, their eyes searching for Frank. It didn't take long to spot him. He was standing near the back of the room, talking to a small group of wealthy patrons, his posture relaxed and confident. To anyone else, he looked like just another successful businessman, charming and charismatic. But to Mabel, he was a predator, and seeing him again sent a chill down her spine. "There he is," Ethan muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched. Mabel's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Frank laugh and joke with the people around him, completely unaware that his past was about to catch up with him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Mabel nodded, her gaze never leaving Frank. "I've been waiting for this moment for years." With that, they approached him. As they got closer, Frank finally noticed them, his smile faltering for a brief moment before he quickly regained his composure. His eyes flicked between Mabel and Ethan, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. Well, Frank said, his voice smooth as ever. "If it isn't my old friend Mabel, and you must be Ethan Johnson. I've heard quite a bit about you." Ethan's expression remained stony. "I'm sure you have," Frank smiled, though there was something predatory in his eyes. "What brings you two to New York? Looking to invest in some art?" Mabel stepped forward, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're here for answers, Frank." Frank raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Answers? I'm not sure I follow." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Mabel said, her voice growing stronger. "You ruined my life. You took everything from me, my career, my daughter, and now we know you were involved with Ethan's mother." Frank's smile faded, his expression hardening. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but I suggest you tread carefully. You're playing a dangerous game." Ethan stepped in, his voice low and firm. "You used my mother to get to me. You think you can keep hiding, but we know the truth now. We're not going to let you get away with it." Frank's eyes darkened, the mask of charm slipping. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" Mabel met his gaze, her voice filled with determination. "We're not afraid of you anymore, Frank. You can't hurt us." For the first time, Frank's composure faltered. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he realized the threat they posed. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the gallery. A figure approached, and when Mabel turned to look, her heart nearly stopped. Standing there, looking just as shocked as Mabel felt, was a woman she hadn't seen in years. It was Sophie. The room seemed to freeze as Mabel stared at the woman standing before her. Sophie, her daughter, the child she had lost so many years ago, taken from her by Frank's manipulation and cruelty. Time seemed to slow, and for a moment, Mabel could hardly breathe. She had dreamed of this moment for years, had prayed for it even when hope seemed impossible. But now that it was happening, the emotions were overwhelming. Sophie looked just as shocked as Mabel, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was a grown woman now, with an air of elegance and poise, but there was something familiar in her face, something that reminded Mabel of the little girl she used to hold in her arms. "Sophie," Mabel whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophie's lips parted, but no words came. She looked between Mabel and Frank, confusion and recognition battling in her eyes. The tension in the air was thick, and Ethan stood beside Mabel, his body tense as he watched the scene unfold. Frank was the first to break the silence, his voice smooth but laced with annoyance. "Sophie, you don't need to be here for this. Why don't you go back inside?" But Sophie didn't move. Her gaze was locked on Mabel, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle that had been missing for years. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are you?" Mabel felt her heart shatter at the question. She had always feared this, that Sophie wouldn't recognize her, that she had been erased from her daughter's memory, but she couldn't let that stop her now. She had come too far, endured too much, to walk away without the truth. "I'm your mother," Mabel said, her voice shaking but steady. "Sophie, I'm your mother." Sophie took a step back, shock flooding her face. "My mother? No, that's not possible. My mother died when I was a child." Mabel's heart clenched, her worst fear realized. Frank had not only taken Sophie from her, he had rewritten the past, convincing Sophie that Mabel was gone. "No, Sophie, that's not true," Mabel said, her voice filled with pain. "I've been alive all these years. Frank, he lied to you. He took you from me." Sophie's eyes darted to Frank, her confusion deepening. "What is she talking about?" she demanded, her voice louder now, more urgent. "Is this some kind of joke?" Frank's expression hardened, the charm and ease that had defined him for so long slipping away. "It's not what you think, Sophie," he said coolly, his voice laced with control. "Mabel abandoned you. I raised you. I gave you everything you needed. Don't let her confuse you." Mabel's body tensed, anger bubbling to the surface. She had been silent for so many years, letting Frank control the narrative, but not anymore. "I never abandoned you, Sophie," Mabel said firmly, taking a step toward her daughter. "Frank took you from me. He lied to you. He manipulated everything." Sophie looked torn, her gaze flicking between Mabel and Frank. The doubt was clear on her face, but Mabel could see that a part of her wanted to believe. There was something in Sophie's eyes that Mabel recognized, a glimmer of the connection they had once shared. "Is it true?" Sophie asked Frank, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Did you take me from her?" Frank's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "I did what I had to do to protect you. Mabel wasn't fit to be a mother. She was reckless, irresponsible. She couldn't provide for you the way I could." Mabel felt a surge of rage, the years of pain and loss boiling to the surface. "You took my life from me, Frank," she spat, her voice rising. "You manipulated me, controlled me, and then you stole Sophie from me. Don't you dare try to twist this into something noble. You're a monster, and you've always been a monster." Frank's jaw tightened, his composure cracking for the first time. "Careful, Mabel," he said coldly. "You're walking a dangerous line." Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "You're not going to intimidate her anymore, Frank. This ends now. Sophie deserves the truth." Sophie stood frozen, the weight of everything crashing down around her. "Is it true?" she asked again, this time her voice directed solely at Frank, her tone pleading for honesty. "Did you lie to me?" Frank hesitated for a moment, and in that brief pause, everything became clear to Sophie. She took a step back, her face pale as the realization hit her. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's true, you lied to me." Mabel's heart ached as she watched her daughter's world collapse. She wanted to reach out, to comfort Sophie, but she didn't know how. So much time had been lost, and the damage Frank had done was deep. But for the first time, Sophie saw the truth, and that was what mattered. "You took everything from me," Sophie said, her voice shaking as she looked at Frank with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You made me believe she was gone. You stole my life." Frank's expression hardened, his eyes cold and calculating. "I did what I had to do, Sophie. You were better off without her." Sophie shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, you don't get to decide that. You don't get to take away my mother." Mabel's heart broke as she watched Sophie struggle with the weight of the betrayal. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it was filled with pain and confusion. The years of separation, the lies, the manipulation, it all came crashing down at once, and Mabel didn't know if their relationship could survive it. "I'm sorry, Sophie," Mabel said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. I never wanted this. I tried to find you. I did everything I could. But Frank, he made sure I couldn't reach you." Sophie wiped at her eyes, her emotions raw. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Ethan stepped in, his voice calm but steady. "Believe this, Sophie. Frank used both of you. He's been playing this game for years, manipulating people, taking control of their lives for his own benefit. He did it to Mabel, and I think he did it to my mother too." Sophie looked at Ethan, her brow furrowed. "Your mother?" Ethan nodded. "There's more to this story, Sophie. I think Frank was involved in my mother's life too, and I believe he had something to do with her death." The room fell silent as Sophie processed everything. The weight of the revelations was overwhelming, and for the first time in her life, she saw Frank for what he truly was: a manipulator, a liar, someone who had twisted her reality for his own gain. Without another word, Sophie turned on her heel and walked out of the gallery, her steps quick and determined. Mabel watched her go, her heart aching, but she didn't follow. She knew Sophie needed time to process, time to heal. There were no easy answers here, no simple solutions. The years of damage Frank had caused couldn't be undone in a single moment. Ethan placed a hand on Mabel's shoulder, offering her a quiet support. "She'll come back, Mabel. She just needs some time." Mabel nodded, though her heart felt heavy with uncertainty. "I hope so," she whispered. I've already lost so much time with her. I don't want to lose her again." Frank, who had been standing silently, finally spoke, his voice low and threatening. "You think you've won. You think this is over." Ethan turned to him, his expression cold. "No, Frank. It's just beginning." With that, Ethan and Mabel walked out of the gallery, leaving Frank behind. There were still so many questions left unanswered, but one thing was certain: they weren't done with Frank. Not by a long shot. As they stepped out into the cool New York air, Mabel took a deep breath. The confrontation with Sophie had been heartbreaking, but it was a start. The truth had finally come to light, and now they had to face whatever came next, together. The chill of the New York evening clung to Mabel as she and Ethan walked away from the gallery. The confrontation with Frank had left her drained, emotionally and physically. Seeing Sophie again after so many years stirred up every emotion she had buried: love, regret, anger, and fear. The moment hadn't gone the way she had imagined it during the endless years of waiting. There had been no joyous reunion, no instant reconnection, just confusion and pain. And Sophie, her little girl, was a woman now, a stranger with the face of the child Mabel had lost. As they turned the corner onto a quieter street, Ethan glanced at Mabel, concern written on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Mabel's throat tightened, but she nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "I thought I was ready for this, but seeing her, it was harder than I expected." Ethan paused, his expression softening. "She just needs time, Mabel. She's been lied to her whole life. Frank's poisoned everything, and it's going to take a while for her to sort through it." "I know," Mabel whispered, her heart aching. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me, or if she'll even want me in her life after all of this." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her, his voice firm but kind. "Sophie's been living in Frank's shadow for years. Now that she knows the truth, it's going to be painful for her, but she'll come around. She'll see who Frank really is, and when she does, she'll realize you were the one who was always there for her, even if you weren't physically with her." Mabel nodded again, though the doubt lingered. She had spent so many nights dreaming of the moment she would be reunited with Sophie, but now that it had happened, it felt like nothing had been resolved. Her daughter had walked away, overwhelmed by the truth and confused by the lies she had lived with for so long. And Frank? Frank was still a looming threat. Mabel knew that this wasn't the end. Frank wasn't going to let them expose him without a fight. Back at the hotel, Ethan and Mabel sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Mabel stared out the window, the lights of the city glittering below, while Ethan flipped through the pages of a folder on his lap. He had spent the last few days gathering more information about Frank's business dealings, hoping to find something, anything, that could bring him down legally. But Frank was slippery, and much of what he had done was buried beneath layers of fake names and shell companies. "I found something," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mabel turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Ethan handed her a document, his expression grim. "It's a record of a deal Frank made with a company that's connected to my mother's estate. He used her name to sign off on some investments right before she died. It looks like he was trying to gain access to her assets after she passed." Mabel's stomach churned as she read the document. "So, he was after her money?" Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. "It looks that way. He must have seen her as a way to get to me, to the company. But when she wouldn't play along, he found a way to manipulate the situation. I don't know if he had anything to do with her actual death, but this proves he was involved in her life right up until the end." Mabel's heart ached for Ethan. She knew how much he had loved his mother, how much her death had broken him. And now, to find out that Frank had been entangled in her final days. It was a betrayal on a level Ethan was still coming to terms with. "We need more than this," Mabel said softly. "If we're going to take him down, we need concrete proof of everything he's done." Ethan nodded in agreement, his eyes hardening with determination. "I know, but this is a start, and it's enough to at least get the ball rolling. I've already contacted some people I trust in the legal world. They're going to help us build a case against him." Mabel let out a shaky breath. She had spent so many years feeling powerless against Frank, but now, with Ethan's help, she finally felt like they had a chance to stop him. Still, the thought of going up against Frank terrified her. He was dangerous, ruthless, and he had a way of manipulating people that always seemed to keep him one step ahead. "What about Sophie?" Mabel asked after a moment. "Do you think she'll want to help us?" Ethan was quiet for a long time, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't know. She's in shock right now, but eventually, I think she'll come around. She's not like Frank. She'll want to do the right thing." Mabel hoped he was right. Sophie had been under Frank's influence for so long, and Mabel didn't know how deep that manipulation went. But she had to believe that the daughter she once knew was still in there, somewhere beneath the layers of lies and control. The next few days were a blur of planning and strategy. Ethan met with his legal contacts, while Mabel tried to reach out to Sophie, sending her messages but getting no response. The silence from Sophie was agonizing, but Mabel tried to give her space, knowing that pushing too hard might only drive her further away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, Mabel received a message from Sophie. "I want to talk. Can we meet?" Mabel's heart raced as she read the words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sophie hadn't cut her off completely. There was still a chance. Mabel immediately responded, setting up a time and place to meet. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city, a neutral ground where they could talk without the weight of Frank's presence hanging over them. The next afternoon, Mabel arrived early, her nerves on edge as she waited. The cafe was quiet, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, with warm lighting and the soft hum of conversation. Mabel's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee, her mind racing with thoughts of how the conversation might go. Finally, the door opened, and Sophie walked in. She looked hesitant, her eyes scanning the room before they landed on Mabel. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Mabel saw the uncertainty and hurt in Sophie's eyes, but she also saw a flicker of something else, something that gave her hope. Sophie approached the table slowly, sitting down across from Mabel without saying a word. The silence between them was heavy, but Mabel didn't rush to fill it. She knew Sophie needed to be the one to start. After a few moments, Sophie spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what to believe." Mabel's heart ached at the vulnerability in her daughter's voice. "I know, and I'm sorry for everything you've been through. I wish I could take away the pain, but all I can do is tell you the truth." Sophie looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "Frank, he raised me. He was all I knew. And now, to find out that everything was a lie, it's hard to wrap my head around." "I understand," Mabel said gently. "He manipulated you the way he manipulated me. He made you believe I wasn't there for you. But Sophie, I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped trying." Sophie's eyes flickered with emotion, but she didn't say anything. "I know it's a lot to process," Mabel continued, her voice soft but steady. "But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know what really happened." Sophie finally looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" Mabel swallowed hard, the weight of the question crushing her. "I tried, Sophie. I tried so hard. But Frank made sure I couldn't. He blocked every avenue I had, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had taken you, and I had no way to reach you." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she processed Mabel's words. "I don't know how to trust you after all these years." Mabel's heart broke at the admission, but she understood. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," she said softly. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We can take this as slow as you need to. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I love you." Sophie wiped at her eyes, her emotions raw. "I need time." Mabel nodded, her voice gentle. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." Sophie stood, her movements slow and uncertain. I'll think about everything." Mabel watched as her daughter turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her with a mixture of hope and heartache. It wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but it was a step. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed her emotional meeting with Sophie, Mabel found herself caught between cautious optimism and deep anxiety. The fact that Sophie had shown up at the cafe and stayed long enough to listen had given Mabel a glimmer of hope. But the uncertainty in Sophie's eyes, her struggle to trust, still weighed heavily on her heart. Mabel knew this journey wasn't going to be easy, but she was prepared to fight for any chance to rebuild her relationship with her daughter. Meanwhile, Ethan had been relentless in his search for more information about Frank. He had uncovered layers of deception, years of carefully crafted lies and fraudulent dealings that stretched back long before his mother's death. The more he discovered, the more Ethan realized just how deep Frank's influence ran. Not only in Mabel's life, but in his own family as well. Frank wasn't just a manipulative ex. He was a threat, someone who had managed to entangle himself in their lives for far too long. Ethan sat at his kitchen table one evening, surrounded by papers and documents he had gathered from lawyers, investigators, and former business associates of Frank. His head ached from the hours of combing through every detail, looking for the one piece of evidence that could bring Frank down once and for all. But it was like trying to unravel a web spun over decades. Each thread seemed to lead to another layer of deceit. Mabel joined him at the table, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of him and sat down, glancing at the mountain of paperwork spread across the table. "You've been at this all day," she said gently. "You should take a break." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Now, I can't stop now. I'm close to finding something. I can feel it. There has to be a way to expose him." Mabel sipped her coffee, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about the connection to your mother? Is there anything in her estate that could link him directly to what happened?" Ethan frowned, shuffling through the papers in front of him. "I've been trying to find that exact link. I know he was involved in some shady investments right before she died, but there's nothing concrete that ties him to her death. Everything is just circumstantial." Mabel's heart ached for Ethan. She could see how much this was weighing on him, the toll it was taking. "Ethan, I know you want to take him down, but you can't carry this burden alone. We'll figure it out together." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "I appreciate that, Mabel, but this is personal. Frank's not just some criminal. He's responsible for my mother's death, I'm sure of it. And now he's done the same thing to you and Sophie. I can't let him get away with this. Mabel reached across the table, placing her hand on his. We'll stop him, Ethan. But you're not in this fight alone. The next day, Ethan received a call from one of his contacts in New York, a private investigator he had hired to look into Frank's business dealings. The investigator had managed to track down one of Frank's former associates, a man who had worked closely with him during the time of Laura's death. The associate was willing to talk, but only in person. He was nervous, afraid of what might happen if Frank found out he was cooperating. Ethan arranged to meet the man at a discreet location in the city, a small diner on the outskirts of Manhattan. Mabel insisted on coming with him. Despite Ethan's concerns about her safety, she wasn't going to sit on the sidelines when it came to taking down the man who had destroyed her life. They arrived at the diner that evening, the atmosphere tense as they waited for Frank's former associate to arrive. The place was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons and a waitress behind the counter. Mabel could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her nerves on edge. She wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, but the stakes were too high for her to back down now. After what felt like an eternity, a man walked through the door, his eyes scanning the room nervously before landing on Ethan and Mabel. He was tall, with graying hair and a worn expression, like someone who had seen too much and was tired of running. He approached their table cautiously, glancing around as if he expected Frank to appear at any moment. "You're Ethan Johnson?" the man asked, his voice low and wary. Ethan nodded. "And you're Vince?" The man, Vince, nodded and slid into the booth across from them, his eyes darting around the diner again. "I don't have much time. If Frank finds out I'm talking to you, well, let's just say he's not the forgiving type." Ethan leaned forward, his tone serious. "We need to know everything you can tell us about Frank. How he operated, what he was involved in, and more importantly, how he's connected to my mother." Vince sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Frank's a snake. He's been playing the long game for years, using people, manipulating situations to his advantage. He's got his hands in everything, business deals, investments, even personal lives. Your mother, she was just another mark for him. He saw her as a way to get to you, to your company." Mabel listened intently, her stomach churning at the thought of Frank using Laura as part of his schemes. "What about me?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What did Frank want from me?" Vince hesitated, glancing at Mabel before speaking. "You were different, Frank. He's always been a control freak, but with you, it was personal. He wanted to own you, to shape you into something he could use. When you started resisting, when you wouldn't let him control you the way he wanted, he decided to take everything from you." Mabel's heart sank. She had always known that Frank's manipulation had been about control, but hearing it laid out like this was gut-wrenching. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Did Frank have anything to do with my mother's death? Was it an accident, or did he have a hand in it?" Vince hesitated again, clearly weighing the danger of what he was about to say. "I don't have proof," he said finally, "but I heard things, people talking. There were whispers that Frank was involved, that he set things in motion to make sure she wouldn't be around to stop him. But you'll never find anything solid. Frank's too good at covering his tracks." Ethan's fists tightened, the frustration building inside him. There has to be something, some way to bring him down. Vince shook his head. "If you want to take him down, you'll need to get him to slip up. He's careful, but he's not invincible. Sooner or later, his ego will get the better of him." Mabel and Ethan exchanged a glance. They had been fighting Frank in the shadows for too long, reacting to his moves instead of taking control of the situation. If they were going to stop him, they needed to force him into a mistake. Ethan leaned forward, his voice cold and determined. "We're going to take him down, Vince, and we're not stopping until we do." Vince stood, nodding grimly. "Good luck. You're going to need it." After Vince left, Mabel and Ethan sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything they had learned. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but now they had a clearer sense of who Frank really was and how far he would go to protect his secrets. "We need to force his hand," Ethan said, his voice low. "Get him to make a mistake, something public." Mabel nodded, her mind racing. "But how? Frank's too careful. He'll see us coming." Ethan's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form in his mind. "He won't if we make him think he's in control." Mabel looked at him, curious. "What are you thinking?" "We'll set a trap," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We'll use his own ego against him. And this time, we'll be ready." As they left the diner and stepped out into the cool night air, Mabel felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, she felt like they had the upper hand. They were no longer running from Frank, they were coming for him, and this time they wouldn't stop until the truth was fully exposed. The weight of the plan they were crafting hung over Mabel and Ethan as they returned to the hotel later that night. Their conversation with Vince had confirmed what they had feared all along. Frank wasn't just a con artist. He was a man who would do anything, no matter how ruthless, to maintain control. And now it was up to them to bring him down. But the risk was enormous. Frank had destroyed lives before, and they knew he wouldn't hesitate to do it again if he felt cornered. Mabel couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. Though the meeting at the cafe had been a small step, Sophie had still been confused, torn between the lies Frank had fed her and the truth Mabel was trying to show her. Mabel knew that time was running out. If Frank found out they were closing in on him, he would tighten his grip on Sophie, and she might disappear from Mabel's life forever. As they sat in the hotel room, poring over the details of the trap they were setting, Mabel voiced her concerns. "Frank's not just going to slip up easily," she said, her voice tense. "If we make a move too soon, he'll catch on. And if that happens, I'll lose Sophie for good." Ethan looked up from the document spread across the table, his expression serious. "I know. That's why we have to be smart about this. We need to hit him where he's vulnerable. His ego. Vince was right. Frank thinks he's untouchable. We have to use that against him." Mabel ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing with worry. "But how? What's going to make him let his guard down?" Ethan paused, thinking deeply. "We need to create a situation that's too good for him to resist, something that looks like an opportunity, something he can't pass up." Mabel frowned, unsure. "Like what?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sharp with determination. "We bait him with a deal. Something big, something that feeds into his need for control and power, but we make sure it's rigged from the start. We'll set him up, and when he takes the bait, we'll have everything we need to expose him." Mabel hesitated. The plan was risky, but she knew Ethan was right. Frank's arrogance was his greatest weakness. If they could exploit that, they might have a chance to take him down. Still, the thought of playing this dangerous game with someone as unpredictable as Frank made her stomach churn. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked quietly. Ethan met her gaze, his voice firm. "It has to. We don't have any other choice." The following day, Ethan put the plan in motion. Using his business connections, he created a fake investment opportunity, a high-stakes, exclusive deal that would be impossible for Frank to ignore. It was the kind of scheme that Frank had built his career on, manipulating powerful people, gaining access to assets, and making money in the shadows. This time, though, Ethan would be in control, watching Frank's every move. Mabel, meanwhile, focused on Sophie. She couldn't lose sight of what was most important, rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Though Sophie had asked for space, Mabel wasn't going to let her slip away again. She reached out carefully, sending Sophie messages, little pieces of her life and her love, trying to bridge the gap that had formed between them. One afternoon, to Mabel's surprise, Sophie responded. The message was short, but it was enough to make Mabel's heart race. "Can we meet again? I have questions." Mabel immediately agreed, setting up another meeting at the same cafe. This time, she went in with more hope. Sophie wasn't rejecting her. She was trying to understand, trying to find her way through the confusion Frank had created. When Mabel arrived at the cafe, she found Sophie already sitting at the same table they had shared before. She looked different this time, more guarded, but also more focused. It was clear that she had spent the last few days thinking deeply about everything Mabel had told her. As Mabel sat down, Sophie wasted no time. "Tell me everything," Sophie said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "No more half-truths. I need to know what really happened between you and Frank." Mabel took a deep breath, knowing that this was her chance to finally give Sophie the truth she deserved. "When I met Frank, I thought he was everything I wanted," Mabel began, her voice soft but steady. "He was charming, successful, and he made me feel like I was important. But over time, I realized that he wasn't the man I thought he was. He was controlling, manipulative, and cruel. He used my love for you against me, Sophie. He made me believe that I wasn't good enough to be your mother, that I was a failure. And when I tried to leave him, he took you from me." Sophie listened, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you try harder?" Mabel's heart broke at the question. "I did, Sophie. I tried everything. But Frank, he had connections. He made it impossible for me to reach you. He manipulated the legal system, turned people against me. By the time I realized what was happening, he had already poisoned your mind against me. I thought about you every day. I never stopped trying to find a way back to you." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them away, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "He told me you abandoned me, that you didn't want me. I spent my whole life believing that." Mabel reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on Sophie's. "That was never true. I've always loved you, Sophie. I've always wanted you in my life." Sophie pulled her hand away, her eyes filled with pain. "I don't know how to believe you. I don't know what's real anymore." Mabel's heart sank, but she didn't push. "I understand, but I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm telling the truth." Sophie was silent for a long time, her gaze distant as she processed everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about Ethan? How is he involved in all of this?" Mabel took another deep breath, knowing that the next part of the story was even more complicated. Ethan's mother, Laura, was involved with Frank, too. We think Frank was trying to use her to get to Ethan, to manipulate his company and gain control. Ethan's been trying to uncover the truth about what happened to his mother, and we believe Frank might have had a hand in her death. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "Are you saying Frank killed someone?" "We don't know for sure," Mabel said carefully, "but we think he was involved. That's why Ethan and I are working together. We need to expose Frank for who he really is." Sophie sat back in her chair, the weight of everything pressing down on her. "So you're telling me that the man who raised me, who I thought was my father, could be a murderer?" Mabel didn't know how to answer. The truth was too complex, too painful. But she had to be honest with Sophie, no matter how much it hurt. "I'm telling you that Frank is dangerous and that he's hurt a lot of people. I don't know if he's responsible for Laura's death, but I do know that he's capable of terrible things. You've seen it yourself, Sophie. You've seen how he controls people, how he lies." Sophie was quiet, her expression unreadable. "I need time to think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mabel nodded, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." Sophie stood, her movements slow and hesitant. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom," she said softly, the word Mom slipping out almost by accident. Mabel's breath caught in her throat, the word like a fragile gift. "I understand," she whispered. "I just want you to know that I'm not giving up on you." Sophie gave a small nod before walking away, leaving Mabel alone at the table, her heart aching with the weight of the conversation. It wasn't the reunion she had hoped for, but it was a step, a small, fragile step toward the possibility of healing. Back at the hotel, Ethan was waiting for her, his expression tense. "How did it go?" he asked. Mabel sighed, sinking into the chair across from him. "It was hard. She's so confused, Ethan. She doesn't know what to believe, but she called me Mom." Ethan smiled gently. That's something. Mabel nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Yeah, it is. But it's not enough. Not yet. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her silent support. They both knew the battle was far from over, but with every small victory, every moment of truth, they were getting closer. Closer to exposing Frank, closer to reclaiming their lives, and closer to the justice they both deserved. The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Ethan and Mabel found themselves sitting in Ethan's hotel room, once again plotting their next move. The meeting with Sophie had been a small victory, but it was fragile. They knew that Frank was still out there, manipulating everything, and unless they exposed him soon, they could lose whatever progress they had made with Sophie, and possibly much more. Ethan flipped through the papers spread out across the table. It was everything they had on Frank so far. The shady business deals, the connections to his mother's estate, the hints of fraud and manipulation. But as much as they had uncovered, there was still nothing concrete that could definitively tie him to the crimes they suspected, especially his involvement in Laura's death. Mabel sipped her coffee, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. She couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, the confusion in her daughter's eyes, the way she had called her mom for the first time in years. It had given Mabel hope, but it had also filled her with fear. Sophie was still trapped in the middle, torn between the lies Frank had told her and the truth Mabel was fighting to show her. "We need to force Frank's hand," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but Mabel could hear the tension underneath. "If we keep waiting for him to make a mistake, we'll be playing his game forever. We have to make him think he's winning, push him into a corner where he feels invincible." Mabel set her cup down, her brow furrowing. "And how do we do that without tipping him off?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. "He's arrogant. Vince said it himself. Frank thinks he's untouchable. If we present him with an opportunity that's too good to resist, something that strokes his ego and makes him believe he's in control, he'll take the bait." Mabel nodded slowly, following his line of thought. "But how do we get him to trust us? He'll know something's off if we suddenly come to him with a deal." "That's the tricky part," Ethan admitted. "We'll need a middleman, someone he trusts, or at least someone who can get close to him without raising suspicion. Vince might be able to help with that. He knows Frank's network." Mabel glanced at the clock. It was still early, but they didn't have time to waste. Every day they waited was another day Frank could solidify his hold on Sophie and his grip on the lies he had built. "I'll call Vince," Ethan said, reaching for his phone. "We need to set this in motion as soon as possible." As Ethan dialed Vince's number, Mabel's thoughts drifted back to Sophie. She couldn't afford to lose her daughter again. Frank had already stolen so many years from them, and Mabel knew that if Frank realized they were closing in on him, he would do whatever it took to keep Sophie in his grasp. Vince picked up after a few rings, his voice low and cautious. "You're moving fast, Ethan. What's the plan?" Ethan explained their idea, outlining how they intended to use Frank's own arrogance against him. Vince listened carefully, occasionally interjecting with his own insights. By the time Ethan finished, Vince sounded impressed. "That could work," Vince said slowly. "But it's risky. Frank's paranoid. He doesn't trust anyone, especially now that he knows people are looking into his past. You'll need to make the offer airtight, something that looks like it's completely in his favor." Ethan nodded, though Vince couldn't see him. "We know. That's why we need your help. You've been on the inside with Frank before. You know how he thinks." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll see what I can do," Vince said finally. "But you need to be careful. Frank's not just going to walk into a trap without a fight." "We understand," Ethan said firmly, "but this is the only way. We need him to slip up in a way we can use." After hanging up with Vince, Ethan turned to Mabel, his expression thoughtful. "Vince is in. He's going to reach out to someone in Frank's circle. Someone who can get the message to him without raising suspicion." Mabel exhaled slowly, trying to calm the anxious knot in her chest. "And what do we do in the meantime?" Ethan's jaw tightened. We prepare. We get everything in place so when Frank takes the bait, we can move quickly. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Ethan and Mabel worked tirelessly to finalize the details of their trap. They crafted the fake deal meticulously, ensuring that it looked legitimate on the surface while hiding the trap underneath. Ethan pulled in contacts from his business world, people who could vouch for the deal's authenticity, and Mabel helped with the legal aspects, making sure there were no loose ends that could tip Frank off. Days passed, and they waited anxiously for word from Vince. Every phone call, every message, felt like it could be the one that would set everything in motion. The tension in the air was palpable, and Mabel found herself constantly checking her phone, hoping for a message from Sophie as well. Then, finally, the call came. "It's done," Vince said over the phone. "The offer's been made, and Frank's biting. He's interested." Ethan's heart raced. "What's the next step?" "You'll need to meet him in person," Vince said. "He's cautious, but the deal is too good for him to pass up. He wants to meet to finalize the details." Ethan nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. "Where and when?" "Tomorrow night," Vince replied. "There's a private club he uses for his business meetings. It's exclusive, invite only, but I've arranged for you to be on the list. Frank doesn't know it's you yet, just that someone important will be there to close the deal." After hanging up, Ethan turned to Mabel, his eyes filled with determination. "Tomorrow night. It's happening." Mabel's stomach twisted with nerves. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" "We have to be," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "This is our best chance to bring him down." The next evening, Mabel and Ethan prepared for the meeting. They both knew the stakes. If this went wrong, Frank would know they were onto him, and the consequences could be disastrous. But if they succeeded, they would finally have the leverage they needed to expose him. Ethan dressed in a sharp suit, the kind he used to wear for high-level business meetings, though this time the stakes were much higher than any deal he had ever negotiated. Mabel stood beside him, her heart pounding as she checked over the documents one last time. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but intense. Mabel nodded, though her nerves were frayed. "As ready as I'll ever be." They arrived at the private club just before the appointed time. The building was nondescript from the outside, but inside, it was filled with an air of exclusivity. The decor was sleek, modern, and the patrons were clearly people of influence and power. Ethan and Mabel were shown to a private room where they would meet Frank. As they waited, the tension in the room was suffocating. Ethan's mind raced through every possible outcome, while Mabel fought to keep her emotions in check. This was the moment they had been preparing for, and they couldn't afford any mistakes. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened and Frank walked in. He was, as Mabel remembered him, charming, confident, with that same air of superiority that had always defined him. But now, knowing what they did about him, Mabel could see the darkness underneath. Frank smiled as he approached, though his eyes were cold and calculating. "Well, well," Frank said smoothly, his voice dripping with false charm. "I didn't expect to see the two of you here. Quite the surprise." Ethan remained calm, his face unreadable. "We have business to discuss, Frank. Let's get to it." Frank's smile widened, but there was something predatory in his gaze. "Of course. Let's see what you've brought to the table." As they sat down, Ethan and Mabel knew they were entering the most dangerous part of the game. Frank believed he was in control, but they had the upper hand now. They just had to wait for him to make his move, and when he did, they would be ready. The atmosphere in the private room was thick with tension as Frank sat down across from Ethan and Mabel. His confidence was palpable, the smug look on his face, betraying how much he believed he had control of the situation. But Ethan and Mabel knew better. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where Frank, blinded by his arrogance, would make the mistake they needed. The trap was set, and all they had to do was let him walk into it. "Well, I have to say, I'm intrigued," Frank said, leaning back in his chair with a casual air. His eyes flickered between them, But Mabel could see the calculating gleam behind his charm. He wasn't here to listen. He was here to win. Ethan remained calm, keeping his face neutral. "We've presented you with a significant opportunity, Frank. One that benefits everyone involved." Frank smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I'm sure it does. But let's not kid ourselves. This is about what benefits you, isn't it? You've never been one to offer something without expecting a hefty return." Mabel's heart pounded as she watched the interaction unfold. This was the moment where everything could either fall into place or unravel completely. They had carefully crafted the deal, making it appear like the perfect setup for someone like Frank, something irresistible, something that would appeal to his need for power and control. But they needed him to take the bait. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but calm. "This isn't about what I get out of it, Frank. This is about creating something bigger. You've built your empire by knowing how to capitalize on the right opportunities at the right time. This is one of those times." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, though the smile remained on his lips. "You're selling this pretty hard, Ethan. What's the catch?" "There is no catch," Ethan said smoothly, his voice steady. "But there's a window on this deal, and it won't stay open for long. If you're interested, we'll move forward. If not, well, we have other options." Frank's expression shifted slightly, the mention of other options clearly getting under his skin. He didn't like being told he wasn't the only choice. He thrived on being the most important person in the room. The idea that someone else could take what he believed should be his was enough to spark his competitive nature. "Other options, huh?" Frank mused, leaning back in his chair again, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Well, I'm not one to let a good deal slip away." Mabel's breath caught in her throat. Frank was close, so close to walking into the trap. But she knew how careful he was, how paranoid he could be. If anything felt even slightly off, he would pull back, and they would lose their chance. Frank studied them for a moment longer, his eyes sharp. "But before I sign on to anything, I need to know a little more. You know how I operate, Ethan. I don't jump into things without understanding the full picture." Ethan nodded, keeping his tone measured. "Of course. Ask whatever you need to." Frank's gaze shifted to Mabel, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I have to admit, it's interesting to see you involved in all this, Mabel. I always knew you had potential, but I didn't expect to see you sitting at the table for something like this." Mabel's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew Frank was trying to throw her off, to remind her of the power he once held over her. But this time was different. She wasn't the same person she had been when he had controlled her life. She had fought her way back, and now she was stronger than ever. "I'm here because I know what I'm worth," Mabel said quietly, her voice steady, "and I'm not going to let you or anyone else make me doubt that again." Frank's eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "You've grown, Mabel, I'll give you that." Ethan, sensing the shift in the conversation, moved it back to business. "So, Frank, are you in? Or should we look elsewhere?" Frank's eyes lingered on Mabel for a moment longer before turning back to Ethan. There was a pause, a flicker of calculation, and then, finally, he nodded. "I'm in." Mabel felt a surge of relief, though she didn't let it show. This was it. Frank had taken the bait. "Great," Ethan said smoothly, pulling out a folder with the finalized documents. "Let's make it official." Frank reached for the folder, flipping through the pages with a practiced eye. As he scanned the document, everything seemed to be falling into place. But just as they thought the plan was working perfectly, Frank paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Wait," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at one of the clauses in the contract. "What's this about a third-party oversight? I don't recall agreeing to that." Mabel's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment where everything could go wrong. Ethan, remaining calm, leaned forward slightly. "It's just a formality, Frank. Standard practice for deals of this size. It ensures transparency and makes sure all parties are protected. Nothing out of the ordinary." Frank's expression darkened, suspicion creeping into his eyes. "Transparency?" he repeated, his tone sharp. That's not how I do business. Mabel's stomach churned. She knew Frank's paranoia well, and this was exactly the kind of thing that would make him pull back. They couldn't afford to lose him now, not when they were so close. Before Frank could push further, Ethan leaned in, his tone firm but reassuring. Look, Frank, I get it. You don't like having people looking over your shoulder, but in this case, it's necessary. We're talking about millions of dollars here, and everyone involved needs to know the deal is clean. It protects you as much as it protects us. Frank hesitated, his fingers tapping on the table again as he considered Ethan's words. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to walk away, his suspicion outweighing his greed. But then, his arrogance took over. He didn't believe anyone could outsmart him. He was Frank, the man who always came out on top. "All right," Frank said finally, his voice cold, "but I'm watching this closely, Ethan. If I sense anything's off, the deal's dead." Ethan smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Of course. With that, Frank signed the contract, sealing his fate. As they wrapped up the meeting and Frank left the room, Mabel let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. They had done it. Frank had taken the bait, and now they had him right where they wanted him. Ethan turned to Mabel, his expression tense but victorious. "This is it. We've got him." Mabel nodded, though her heart was still racing. "What happens next?" "Now," Ethan said, his voice low, "we prepare for the fallout." The trap was set, but they both knew this wasn't over. Frank was still dangerous, and when he realized what they had done, there would be consequences. But for the first time, they had the upper hand. As they left the club and stepped into the cool night air, Mabel felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The battle wasn't over, but they had taken a huge step forward. Frank's empire was beginning to crack, and soon the whole truth would come to light. But even as they walked away, Mabel couldn't shake the lingering worry about Sophie. Frank had been such a powerful influence in her life, and Mabel didn't know how deep that control went. If Frank realized that Sophie was slipping from his grasp, he might do something desperate. "We need to be careful," Mabel said quietly as they walked. "Frank's not going to let this go without a fight." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "I know, but we're ready for him. He won't be able to hide anymore." As they disappeared into the night, the weight of the coming confrontation hung over them. They had taken the first step in exposing Frank, but the real battle was just beginning. The days after Frank signed the deal were tense, as if the city itself could feel the weight of the trap closing in on him. For Mabel and Ethan, every moment was spent preparing for the next step. They had the documents that would expose Frank, but they knew they needed to execute this perfectly. One misstep, and Frank could slip away, as he had done so many times before. Ethan spent hours on the phone with his legal team, making sure every piece of evidence was airtight, while Mabel worked tirelessly to stay in touch with Sophie. The fragile connection they had begun to rebuild was Mabel's lifeline, and she couldn't risk losing her daughter again, especially with the storm that was about to hit. But Sophie hadn't responded to her last few messages, and Mabel's anxiety was growing. Every day that passed without hearing from her felt like a step backward, a reminder of just how deep Frank's manipulation had gone. Mabel feared that Frank had already sensed what was happening and was tightening his grip on Sophie. One evening, as Mabel sat by the window in Ethan's apartment, staring out at the city below, her phone buzzed. She snatched it up quickly, her heart leaping at the sight of Sophie's name on the screen. "Can we meet? I need to talk." Mabel's breath caught in her throat. She had been waiting for this moment, praying for it, and now it was here. But there was something in Sophie's words, something that felt urgent, maybe even frightened. Without hesitation, Mabel replied, setting up a meeting for the following morning at a small park not far from where Sophie lived. She wanted to make sure it was a place where Sophie felt comfortable, somewhere they could talk without the weight of the past pressing down too heavily. The next morning, Mabel arrived at the park early, her nerves on edge. She sat on a bench near the fountain, watching as families played with their children and couples strolled by. It was a peaceful scene, but Mabel's heart was anything but calm. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie appeared at the edge of the park, her face drawn and serious. She walked toward Mabel with a purpose, but there was something different in her eyes this time, something darker, more troubled. "Sophie," Mabel said softly as her daughter approached. Sophie sat down beside her, her gaze fixed on the ground. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Mabel could feel the tension radiating off of her. Finally, Sophie broke the silence, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything you told me, about Frank, about you, and I've been trying to figure out what's real, what's true." Mabel's heart ached as she listened. She could hear the confusion in Sophie's voice, the deep pain of betrayal. "I know it's a lot to take in," Mabel said gently, "and I'm so sorry that you've had to go through all of this, but I promise you, everything I've told you is the truth." Sophie shook her head, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Frank, he's always been there for me. He raised me. He made me believe you didn't want me, and now I don't know what to believe anymore." Mabel reached out, placing a hand on Sophie's arm, her voice trembling with emotion. "I understand why you feel that way. Frank has controlled the narrative for so long, and he's made it seem like I abandoned you. But I swear, Sophie, I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up on you." Sophie's eyes flickered with pain, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to trust you, Mom. I want to, but..." Mabel's breath hitched at the sound of Sophie calling her Mom again, but she didn't let it break her focus. "You don't have to trust me all at once," she said softly, "but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Sophie's gaze lifted to meet Mabel's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hope, but then, just as quickly, it faded, replaced by something darker. "There's something you don't know," Sophie said, her voice tense. "Frank, he's been acting strange lately. He's been more paranoid than usual, and he keeps talking about people trying to ruin him." Mabel's heart skipped a beat. She knew immediately what Sophie was talking about. Frank was starting to sense that things were unraveling. He was dangerous when cornered. And now, with the deal Ethan had tricked him into signing, Frank was closer to losing everything than ever before. "Sophie," Mabel said carefully, trying to keep the fear out of her voice, "you need to be careful. Frank is not who you think he is. If he feels threatened, he'll do anything to protect himself." Sophie's eyes filled with uncertainty. "What are you saying? That he's going to hurt me?" Mabel shook her head quickly. "No, I don't think he would ever hurt you physically, but he'll try to control you, manipulate you into doing what he wants. And if he thinks you're turning against him..." Sophie's face paled, the weight of Mabel's words sinking in. "He's already been asking me questions," she whispered, "about you, about Ethan. He thinks I've been talking to you." Mabel's heart pounded in her chest. "What did you tell him?" Sophie looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "I told him I didn't know anything, but he didn't believe me." Mabel swallowed hard, the fear she had been trying to suppress rising to the surface. Frank was already suspicious, and if he thought Sophie was working against him, he wouldn't hesitate to use her as leverage. "Sophie, listen to me," Mabel said, her voice urgent. "You need to stay away from him. Don't let him manipulate you any more than he already has. Ethan and I are working to stop him, but we need you to be safe." Sophie looked torn, her emotions warring with each other. "I don't know what to do," she said quietly. "He's been my father my whole life. How do I just walk away from that?" Mabel's heart broke at the pain in Sophie's voice. She reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. "I know it's hard, but he's been lying to you, Sophie. He's been using you, and now he's trying to drag you down with him." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away." Mabel squeezed her hand gently, her voice filled with love. "You are, Sophie. You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. I'm here, and Ethan's here. We'll help you, but you have to trust us." Sophie was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant as she processed everything. Mabel waited, her heart aching for her daughter, knowing how hard this decision was. She had been trapped in Frank's web for so long, and breaking free wasn't something that could happen overnight. Finally, Sophie looked up, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to believe you. I want to believe that I can trust you." Mabel's breath caught, tears welling up in her eyes. "You can, Sophie, I promise you, you can." Sophie nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Okay, I'll stay away from Frank. But what if he comes after me? What if he tries to find me?" Mabel's heart pounded as she thought about the danger Sophie could be in. "We'll protect you," she said firmly. "Ethan has contacts who can help. We won't let Frank get to you." Sophie exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of years of fear and confusion. "I don't want to be part of his world anymore," she said softly. "I don't want to live in his lies." Mabel reached out, pulling Sophie into a hug. It was the first time they had embraced since they were reunited, and Mabel felt the years of pain and separation melting away, if only for a moment. "I love you, Sophie," Mabel whispered, her voice breaking. "I never stopped loving you." Sophie clung to her mother, her voice trembling. "I love you too, Mom." They stayed like that for a long time, the world around them fading into the background. For the first time in years, Mabel felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could heal from everything Frank had done. But even as they held each other, Mabel knew that the fight wasn't over. Frank was still out there, and he wasn't going to let go of his empire without a fight. And when he found out that Sophie had turned against him, he would come for them. The day after Mabel and Sophie's emotional meeting, the weight of what they had to do pressed heavily on both Mabel and Ethan. The trap they had set for Frank was slowly tightening, but they both knew that as soon as Frank sensed he was losing control, he would become more dangerous than ever. Mabel had managed to convince Sophie to stay away from him, but that only meant Frank would be looking for her, desperate to regain his grip on the one person he still believed he controlled. Ethan spent the morning in meetings with his legal team, finalizing the documents that would expose Frank's fraudulent dealings and tie him directly to Laura's death. The evidence they had gathered over the last few weeks had painted a clear picture of Frank's manipulation, but Ethan knew that getting justice wouldn't be as simple as just turning over the evidence. Frank was powerful, with connections in high places, and he would use every resource at his disposal to fight back. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to the apartment where Mabel was waiting, her nerves clearly on edge. She paced the room, her thoughts bouncing between her worry for Sophie and the looming confrontation with Frank. It was only a matter of time before Frank realized the full scope of the trap they had set, and when that happened, there was no telling how he would react. "How's Sophie?" Ethan asked as he stepped inside, noticing the tension in Mabel's posture. "She's staying at a friend's place for now," Mabel replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "She didn't want to go home, not while Frank is still looking for her." Ethan nodded. "That's good. We need to keep her away from him until this is over." Mabel stopped pacing and turned to face Ethan, her eyes filled with worry. "What if this doesn't work, Ethan? What if Frank finds her before we can stop him?" Ethan crossed the room and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can, Mabel. The evidence we've collected is solid. Once we turn it over to the authorities, Frank won't be able to escape. But we need to be patient. We can't rush this." Mabel sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I just want this to be over. I want Sophie to be safe." "She will be," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We'll make sure of it." The rest of the day passed slowly, each hour feeling like an eternity as they waited for the final pieces of their plan to fall into place. Ethan received a call from one of his contacts in law enforcement, confirming that they were ready to move on Frank as soon as the evidence was officially submitted. It was a small reassurance, but it still didn't ease the growing sense of dread that hung in the air. That evening, as Mabel and Ethan sat quietly in the living room, the tension was broken by the sound of Ethan's phone buzzing. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from one of his contacts. "Frank's onto you. He knows something's up. Be careful." Ethan's stomach dropped as he read the message, and he immediately turned to Mabel, his voice urgent. "Frank knows. Mabel's eyes widened in fear. What do you mean? How does he know? I don't know how, but he's figured out that we're coming after him, Ethan said, his mind racing. We need to act now, before he does something reckless. Mabel's heart pounded in her chest. If Frank was onto them, that meant Sophie was in even greater danger. Frank wasn't just going to let this go, he would come for them, and he would use anyone he could to protect himself. We need to warn Sophie, Mabel said quickly, reaching for her phone. Ethan nodded. Tell her to stay where she is. We'll figure out how to protect her. Mabel dialed Sophie's number, her hands shaking as she waited for her daughter to pick up. The phone rang once, twice, and then, Sophie, Mabel said, her voice breathless. Mabel! Sophie's voice was filled with concern. What's going on? You sound scared. Mabel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Listen to me, Sophie. Frank knows what we're doing. He knows we're trying to stop him, and I think he might come after you. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Mabel could hear the fear in Sophie's voice when she finally spoke. Well, what do I do? Stay where you are, Mabel said firmly. Don't go anywhere. Ethan and I will figure out how to keep you safe. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then said softly, Okay, but Mom, be careful. Frank isn't going to let this go without a fight. Mabel's heart broke at the fear in Sophie's voice. I know, honey, but we're going to stop him, I promise. After hanging up, Mabel turned to Ethan, her hands trembling. We need to end this, Ethan. We can't keep waiting. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. We'll turn over the evidence tonight. We can't risk giving Frank any more time. They spent the next hour preparing everything they needed, gathering the documents and making sure all the evidence was in order. Once it was ready, Ethan called his contact in law enforcement, arranging to meet him and officially hand over the files. It was the final step in their plan, the moment that would set everything in motion. As they prepared to leave, a sense of unease settled over Mabel. Something didn't feel right. Frank had always been 2 steps ahead, always able to manipulate the situation to his advantage. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something they hadn't anticipated. Are you sure this is going to work? Mabel asked as they headed out the door. Ethan glanced at her, his expression serious. It has to. We've covered every angle. Once the authorities have the evidence, Frank won't have anywhere to hide. But even as he said the words, Ethan felt the same unease creeping in. Frank was dangerous, unpredictable, and they had no idea what he might do when he realized his empire was crumbling. They arrived at the agreed-upon location, a quiet parking garage on the edge of the city. Ethan's contact, Detective Harris, was already there, waiting for them. As they approached, Harris gave them a curt nod, his expression grim. You've got everything? Harris asked, his eyes scanning the area. Ethan handed over the file, his voice steady. It's all here. This should be enough to bring him down. Harris flipped through the documents briefly, his brow furrowing in concentration. Good. We'll move on this first thing in the morning. Frank won't know what hit him. Mabel exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a small sense of relief for the first time in days. They had done it. The evidence was in the right hands, and soon Frank would be exposed for the criminal he was. But just as they turned to leave, the sound of tires screeching echoed through the garage, followed by the roar of an engine. Mabel's heart leapt into her throat as a black SUV sped toward them, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Get down! Harris shouted, pulling his gun from his holster as the SUV skidded to a stop in front of them. The doors of the SUV flew open, and before Mabel could react, a group of men spilled out, guns drawn. She felt Ethan grab her arm, pulling her behind a concrete pillar as gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Mabel's mind raced as she crouched behind the pillar, her heart pounding in her chest. This was Frank. He had found them. Ethan's voice was low and urgent as he spoke into her ear. We have to get out of here. He's trying to stop us before we can take him down. Mabel nodded, her fear almost paralyzing her, but she knew they couldn't afford to stay. They had come too far to lose everything now. As they crouched behind the pillar, Mabel's thoughts turned to Sophie. She prayed that her daughter was safe, far away from the chaos that was unfolding. But as the gunfire continued, Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Frank wasn't going to let them go easily. He had too much to lose, and the battle to bring him down had only just begun. The gunfire echoed through the parking garage, each shot vibrating through the concrete walls. Mabel and Ethan remained huddled behind the pillar, their hearts racing as they tried to make sense of the chaos. The reality of what was happening, Frank's men coming after them in such a violent, desperate way, was almost too much to comprehend. But it was clear now. Frank was not going to let go of his empire quietly. He had sent his men to silence them before the evidence could be used against him, and there was no doubt that this was a fight for survival. Detective Harris, gun drawn, moved swiftly, firing back at the men who had emerged from the SUV. His years of experience were evident in his calm precision, but it was obvious that they were outnumbered. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and Mabel's heart pounded as she realized just how close they were to losing everything. "We need to move!" Ethan's voice was urgent, his hand gripping Mabel's arm tightly. Mabel nodded, her fear nearly paralyzing her, but she forced herself to stand. They couldn't afford to be trapped here. As they began to move, darting from pillar to pillar, the sound of gunfire grew louder. Mabel's thoughts raced back to Sophie. Her daughter was still out there, hopefully safe. But if Frank's men were willing to come after them, there was no telling what he might do next. Ethan grabbed Mabel's hand and pulled her behind another barrier, just as a bullet whizzed past them. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice tense but steady. "We need to get out of here." Mabel nodded, her mind racing. "What about Harris?" she asked, glancing back at the detective who was exchanging fire with Frank's men. Ethan hesitated, but before he could answer, Harris shouted over the gunfire, "Go! Get out of here! I'll hold them off!" Mabel's stomach twisted with fear for the detective, but she knew they had no choice. If they didn't escape, everything they had worked for would be lost. The evidence against Frank was still with Harris, and as long as it stayed out of Frank's hands, there was still hope. Ethan pulled her toward the exit, and they ran, their footsteps echoing through the garage as they weaved between cars, keeping low to avoid the gunfire. Mabel's lungs burned as they sprinted toward the stairwell that led to the street level. It felt like every second stretched into an eternity, but finally, they reached the door. Bursting through the exit, they found themselves in the cold night air, the city streets eerily quiet compared to the chaos they had just left behind. Ethan glanced around, scanning for any signs of danger, before pulling Mabel down the sidewalk, away from the garage. "We need to get somewhere safe," he said, his breath heavy with exertion. Mabel nodded, still catching her breath, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. "What if they come after Sophie?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We'll call her as soon as we're clear. We'll make sure she's protected." As they moved quickly through the streets, Mabel's mind flashed back to all the moments that had led them here. The years of manipulation, the lies, and the heartbreak that Frank had caused. He had taken so much from them, from her and Sophie, and now, in his desperation to hold on to power, he was willing to destroy anyone in his path. They reached a safer part of the city, and Ethan pulled out his phone, dialing Detective Harris's number. Mabel's heart pounded in her chest as they waited for an answer, but the phone rang and rang with no response. "He's not picking up," Ethan said, his voice filled with concern. "We need to call my contact in the police department." Before Ethan could make the call, Mabel's phone buzzed in her pocket. She quickly pulled it out, her heart leaping when she saw Sophie's name on the screen. "Sophie?" Mabel answered, her voice breathless. "Mom," Sophie's voice came through, sounding shaken. I think someone's following me. I'm at a friend's house, but I saw a car parked outside. I don't know what to do." Mabel's heart nearly stopped. Frank's men were already closing in on Sophie. "Listen to me, Sophie," Mabel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Stay inside. Don't go anywhere. We're coming to get you." Ethan was already moving, hailing a cab as Mabel spoke to Sophie. Within moments, they were on their way to the address Sophie had given them, every second filled with the terrifying realization that Frank's reach was even longer than they had anticipated. As the cab sped through the city streets, Mabel gripped her phone tightly, fear coursing through her veins. She had fought so hard to get Sophie back, to protect her from Frank's lies. And now, just when they were so close to exposing the truth, Frank was trying to take her away again. "We'll get to her in time," Ethan said quietly, sensing Mabel's fear. Mabel nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She prayed they would reach Sophie before it was too late. When the cab pulled up in front of the house where Sophie was staying, Mabel and Ethan immediately noticed the black sedan parked across the street. The engine was running, and two men sat inside, their eyes trained on the house. "Stay close," Ethan whispered as they stepped out of the cab. Mabel's heart raced as they approached the house, her eyes darting toward the sedan. The men inside didn't make a move, but Mabel knew they were watching. She had no doubt they were Frank's men, sent to make sure Sophie didn't escape. They quickly reached the door, and Mabel knocked, her hands trembling. Moments later, the door opened, and Sophie stood there, her face pale with fear. "Mabel! Ethan!" Sophie's voice cracked as she pulled them inside. "They've been outside for hours. I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing," Mabel said, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. "We're going to get you out of here." But before they could make a plan, the sound of footsteps echoed on the porch, and Mabel's heart lurched as she realized the men from the sedan were approaching the house. "They're coming," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with terror. Ethan moved quickly, pulling Sophie and Mabel deeper into the house. "We need to get to the back. There's an alley behind the house. We can slip out before they get in." Mabel's heart pounded as they moved through the house, the sound of the front door being forced open, sending a surge of adrenaline through her. They reached the back door just as the men entered the house, their voices low and threatening. "Hurry," Ethan urged, opening the door to the alleyway. "We don't have much time." Mabel grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her through the door as they slipped out into the night. The alley was dark and narrow, but it offered a way out. Away from Frank's men and away from the danger that was closing in on them. As they ran down the alley, Mabel's mind raced. They had come so far, and they couldn't let Frank take them down now. She had to protect Sophie. She had to stop Frank from destroying everything she had fought for. They reached the end of the alley and emerged onto a quiet street, breathing heavily. Ethan quickly called for another cab, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. "We need to go somewhere safe," Ethan said as they climbed into the cab. "Somewhere Frank can't reach us." Mabel nodded, her mind still reeling from the close call. "What about Harris?" she asked, her voice shaky. "We'll call him as soon as we're somewhere safe," Ethan replied. "But right now, we need to make sure Frank's men can't follow us." As the cab drove off into the night, Mabel held Sophie close, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and fear. They had escaped for now, but Frank was still out there, still dangerous. The evidence against him was strong, but Mabel knew that Frank would do whatever it took to protect himself. But as they drove away, Mabel felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from Frank. She wasn't the frightened woman he had once controlled. She was stronger now, stronger because of Sophie, because of Ethan, because of the love she had fought so hard to reclaim. And no matter what Frank tried to do, Mabel knew one thing for sure: they were going to bring him down. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.